hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Good morning, and I want to thank today's witnesses for joining the subcommittee's ongoing discussion on the status of the Boeing 737 MAX. Today's hearing is the second in a series of investigating the tragic Boeing 737 MAX accidents. The purpose of today's hearing is to hear from people who fly the airplanes and from the people who fly in the airplanes and those who represent them. A total of 346 people have died in the Lion Air and Ethiopian airline accidents, and their loved ones deserve answers. The traveling public's confidence in U.S. aviation is shaken. Congress, the administration, and industry must work together to restore confidence in air travel. The foundation of this committee's investigation into the Boeing 737 MAX is ensuring safety. As I've said before, if the public does not feel safe about flying, then they won't fly. If they don't fly, airlines don't need to buy airplanes. If they don't need to buy airplanes, airplanes don't need to be built, and if there's no need to build airplanes, there will be no jobs in aviation. The foundation of the aviation industry is its safety. And today's hearing builds on the committee's ongoing investigation. Safety remains this committee's guiding principle, and this committee will use all tools to reduce the likelihood of future tragedies. I want to start by updating subcommittee members and the public on the committee's work since last month's hearing. Chair DeFazio and I continue to engage with the Federal Aviation Administration, the NTSB, Boeing, pilots, aviation stakeholders, and others about these accidents. Second, the committee's oversight and investigation team continues to work with the FAA and Boeing on securing records that the chair and I requested on the certification of the MAX. More recently, Chair DeFazio and I have recently wrote to Transportation Secretary Chow and FAA Acting Administrator Elwell, expressing concerns about the slow pace of the FAA's response to our records request. It is my expectation that both will cooperate with the committee's investigation in a timely manner. Third, we have written to Boeing, United Technologies Corporation, and the FAA requesting a timeline and supporting documents related to the awareness of when the angle of attack of the AOA disagree alert on some Boeing 737 MAX planes was defective, as well as when the groups notified airlines about this defect. The committee is aware of information suggesting that Boeing decided in November 2017 to defer a software update to correct the AOA disagree alert defect until 2020, 3 years after discovering the flaw, and only accelerated its timeline after the October 2018 Lion Air accident. This information is deeply concerning, and the committee must find out what Boeing knew, when the company knew it, and who it informed. I also have questions about the decision to not deem the AOA disagree alert as safety critical. The information the committee is requesting will help us better understand these management decisions. And I, as well, again, encourage all members of the subcommittee to continue personally monitoring the situation. Staff continues to be available for any questions the subcommittee may have surrounding our investigation and can provide you with updates as they become available. What I hope to hear today from witnesses. More than 300 Boeing 737 MAX planes have been grounded worldwide since the Ethiopian Airlines accident in March, and more than 130 are parked. More than 4,500 orders for the MAX worldwide remain unfilled since Boeing stopped delivery, and that's over a longer period of time. Today's hearing is an opportunity to gather views and perspectives from key users of the aircraft, pilots, flight attendants, the industry, and those representing passengers' views on what the FAA, Boeing, and airlines need to do before returning the 737 MAX to service. The committee is not here yet to make conclusions as to what caused these accidents. That's the NTSB's job. But as with any aviation accident, investigators must consider a multitude of factors, including aircraft design, aircraft maintenance, weather, and human performance before making a final determination of probable cause or causes. In the end, there will be a root cause and there will be contributing factors. Nevertheless, it is critical the public hear from frontline stakeholders as part of our oversight work. Captain Kerry and Captain Sullenberger, I look forward to hearing the pilot's perspective on these accidents, the pilot's role in the FAA certification process, and associated pilot training. Ms. Nelson, flight attendants are on the front lines with passengers. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what must take place to restore the confidence of the flying public and help you perform your important work. Ms. Pinkerton, I'd like to hear more about the impact of the grounding on airlines engagement with the FAA and Boeing on certification of the aircraft and related fixes and next steps to ensure safety. And Mr. Babbitt, as a former FAA administrator, I look forward to your thoughts on the importance of coordination of the international aviation community on this issue and how the FAA can regain its credibility and restore the public's trust. And I hope today's testimony will help this committee better understand what is needed to restore the trust of the flying public and show this committee's commitment to safety by asking all the appropriate questions. As Congress seeks answers surrounding the Lion Air and the Ethiopian Airlines accidents, this committee must also work to restore the public confidence in the MAX and the FAA's mission, importantly, to maintain the safety of U.S. aviation and aerospace. The committee will continue its thorough investigation until it fully understands all the issues surrounding the 737 MAX accidents. And I'll continue to work with Chair DeFazio, my colleagues, Representative Graves and Representative Graves, and the full committee, as well as FAA, NTSB, Boeing, aviation stakeholders, and the families of victims throughout this process. So again, I want to thank today's witnesses. I look forward to hearing your insights, and now turn to Representative Graves of Louisiana for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know why you keep mispronouncing my name and pronouncing his the right way. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I think the most important thing that we all need to stay focused on is the families and the victims. I'm once again very, very sorry for your loss. Anything we do that loses sight that this is about people, it's about lives lost, it's about safety, is a distraction. And throughout this process, we need to stay 100% focused on lessons learned, on safety, and making sure that this does not happen again. In light of that, I want to go through and reference some of the different committees and efforts that are underway right now to ensure that we do extract every lesson learned from these disasters and make sure that other families don't have to go through the devastating situation that these families are going through today. Right now, the Special Committee on Safety, Oversight, and Certification Advisory Committee, is a DOT-initiated group, is going through studying this process, lessons learned from the disasters. The Safety, Oversight, Certification Advisory Committee that, once again, DOT has established is going through and evaluating the lessons learned here. Joint Authorities Technical Review is FAA-initiated group that's looking at this. The Boeing Board of Directors has a review committee that Boeing initiated. The Technical Advisory Board, FAA initiated. The various Department of Transportation Inspector General investigations that are underway right now. And as I recently became aware, this committee is doing an investigation and has hired investigators to look at this as well. So there are numerous efforts that are underway right now to ensure that we chart a better path forward. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Thank you to every single one of you, and I did have a chance to review your testimony. Ms. Nelson, you make a really important point in your testimony, talking about how we need to ensure that we don't allow this to erode the United States sort of standing in the international aviation community. And you're exactly right about that. We need to ensure we do that. Captain Sullenberger, thank you for being here. In your testimony, you talk about the chain of events, and I think you use the term casual chain of events that contributed to this. We need to make sure, a lot of people are focused on one single aspect of this, but I think it is important. Your testimony is exactly right, that we do need to look at every aspect, not just one. Certainly the MCAS system has been a focus of this, and it needs to continue to be. But we need to make sure we look at every other step in the process as well to make sure that we don't fix one thing and don't recognize perhaps the failures or challenges associated with other aspects of this. And I appreciate that. Mr. Babbitt, Administrator Babbitt, thank you for your testimony. And you talked about your confidence in the FAA certification system. And I think you said in your testimony that it's not perfect. But one of the things that you do have faith in, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but I'll leave it in your testimony, you talked about how the certification process may be imperfect, but you do have a lot of faith in our ability to adapt and fix it. One of the things in reviewing all of your testimony that comes to mind, we are becoming more heavily reliant upon technology. We know it in everything that we do. And I've got my old car that I drive that has virtually no technology, and if I get in somebody who's got a newer car and all of the different sensors that are out there on the rearview mirrors, when you're changing lanes, when you're fading off, when you're going too fast, it is somewhat overwhelming, and it's very different. Is it making us become more complacent in driving and flying planes? And if so, how do we challenge that? How do we challenge that us becoming more complacent and ensuring that we stay as live as on top of what we're doing and don't become too dependent upon this technology? How does that technology challenge the certification process? How does the certification process need to adapt to the fact that we're becoming more reliant upon technology to ensure, once again, that we're staying live, that we're paying attention to what's happening? Look, at the end of the day, I'm going to circle back to where I started. This is about safety and it's about people. And there have been many efforts that we've seen over the past few months to make this a partisan effort. And I cannot disagree with that more. I think it's a huge mistake to do that. There's nothing that's partisan about this. Every single one of us that are here today, in this room, every one of us that's on this dais, we all need to stay singularly focused on the fact this is about safety and people. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this second hearing today, and looking forward to the witnesses. I do want to make note, we have a markup in another committee, 4 bills that are very much related to the state that I represent, and I'm going to have to run in and out. I think we have 80 amendments over there, so yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves, and it's fair for you to make sure you make your votes in your markup. We appreciate that. But before I turn to Chair DeFazio for an open statement, I just ask unanimous consent following be entered in the hearing of today's record of today's hearing, a June 12 letter from Ms. Nadia Milleron and Mr. Michael Stumo to Chair DeFazio, and the written testimony from the Association of Professional Flight Attendants. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And with that, I'll turn to Chair DeFazio for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, of course, our second hearing. I don't think we should be here today. I don't think 346 people should have died, and I believe that this was preventable. We have family here today who lost a daughter, and we'll hear from them at a future meeting. But there are a lot of questions that still remain unanswered, and we're pressing forward with this as a very comprehensive investigation. A lot of it leads back to the organization delegation authority process, certification process, the question about the role of engineers in this process versus that of operators, pilots, and other safety professionals who work on those planes. It's inexplicable to me, and I asked in the first hearing, I asked the acting administrator, I said, is this a safety critical system, MCAS? And he said, yes. And my question then was, how could we allow a safety critical system with a single point of failure? We do not allow that in the aviation industry. Well, the answer from Boeing at an early meeting after Lion Air was, well, the pilots were the backup system. The pilots didn't know it existed. And the original system was relatively mild. 0.6 degrees of deflection, not repeated overrides of the pilot's command, and that was in the manual. But then the Boeing engineers changed it to 2.5 degrees, repeated overriding the pilot's decision, and asked the FAA to take it out of the manual. Now that to me is shocking. It's in the first manual when it's a relatively mild system that kind of is similar to what they're proposing with their fix, except it will have 2 angle of attack sensors input and other modifications. So how could the FAA agree to that? Did they understand what it did? Did anybody understand what this would do? I don't think the implications were fully known. There have been 14 versions of this plane since '67. It has been an incredible and workhorse airplane. I've flown on one, I'm sure, thousands of times. I've flown up 6 million miles since I've been in Congress. So many, many, many times. But at some point, you got to think there's a cutoff where this is a new plane and it's different than the one from 1967. And it shouldn't just be an amended type certificate. It has to go through recertification. Now, of course, that's a longer process. It's more expensive. It might require pilot retraining. And the question is, why didn't we get to that point with this plane? And that also goes for the longer term, looking at the certification ODA process. Further, we discovered that the disagree light was inoperable in many of the planes, the ones that hadn't bought the extra package, apparently inadvertently, according to engineers. But this was not reported to FAA for a year, and until it became public, Boeing had no intention of fixing that to 2020. Could that have played a role in helping to prevent these tragedies? Well, we'll never quite know that, will we? That's unacceptable. And we have been in touch with both Boeing itself and United Technologies Corporation, who designed that software, to ask for a timeline and some explanation of how they think that is a proper procedure. We're going to hear today from a number of people who are going to provide compelling testimony. I won't go through the list again. Others have mentioned it, but I want to thank you for being here today. We have now begun to receive substantial numbers of documents from both Boeing and the FAA, and I have the Oversight staff and the Aviation staff going through those documents. And we will, fully expect, at a future hearing, have the FAA back in and have Boeing into this committee once we have the documentation digested that we need to ask the meaningful, very pointed questions we will ask. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. Recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Representative Graves of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Ranking Republican Graves for having this hearing. And I also want to express my condolences to the families and friends of the accident victims. Today's hearing is going to focus on how to safely return the 737 MAX back to surface. And this process, it has to be careful, it has to be deliberative, and all involved have to be absolutely laser focused on safety. I believe everyone at the FAA and at Boeing understand that to do anything less than that is absolutely unacceptable. We owe it to all of those who tragically lost their lives to get this, to get it right. As this process moves forward, input from the stakeholders, both in the United States and around the world, is going to be very important. And today, the subcommittee is going to hear from some of those stakeholders. As many of you know, I'm extremely proud of our aviation system here in the United States, and much of that pride stems from how safe our system has been. And knowing how imperative it is that we maintain this record and reputation for that matter, I want to share some of my thoughts on safely ungrounding the 737 MAX. First, the FAA's process to certify the 737 MAX, to certify the fix on the MAX, it has to be and will be a very intensive process. The FAA is going to conduct technical and operational reviews and assessments, simulator and flight testing. There's going to be evaluations and reevaluations and reevaluations on top of that. And they're also going to share information with and consider the comments and recommendations from the stakeholders that are out there. And ultimately, I anticipate that the FAA is going to issue multiple notices and multiple directives and orders. In addition, the Technical Advisory Board of the TAB, and we'll hear a lot about that, with experts on there from the FAA, from the U.S. Air Force, from NASA, from the VOLPE, the National Transportation Systems Center. They're all going to conduct a parallel and an independent review, and the FAA is going to consider their recommendations in this process. Boeing is going to need to demonstrate compliance with safety regulations and with the FAA directives. U.S. airlines are also going to have to demonstrate compliance with all FAA directives, and they will need to implement the required training across their fleets. Internationally, each country is going to have to make its own ungrounding decision. And the FAA is going to share information, and they're going to provide assistance as it's requested. And I'm glad that the FAA is working with the international regulators towards finding consensus regarding the certification and return to service the 737 MAX. The second thing is the FAA is working with Boeing, they're working with the airlines, they're working with pilots and international regulators, and they're going to determine what training is going to be required, both prior to the ungrounding and as recurrent training obviously moves forward in this process. And I believe it is critically important that we avoid focusing primarily just on pilot training on the old MCAS system and what occurred in the two MAX accidents, because there is real concern that training to the old system could result in negative training by unintentionally introducing or reinforcing outdated information or inapplicable concepts which could actually decrease safety, and they could actually decrease safety. The third thing is, I think it's vitally important that we allow for the various investigations or reviews to run their full course before we take any legislative action. To act preemptively it's only going to be for optics. And for people to be able to say that we did something, that's what that would only be about, rather than solving what I think is an identifiable problem in our system. Aviation accidents rarely have one contributing factor. Those of us who fly, we know that. There's always a number of investigations, and there are a number of investigations that are looking at the certification of the 737 MAX. And if problems are found, I do believe that they have to be addressed. But in reading the preliminary accident reports, as well as obviously many others with a lot of flying experience, many have raised concerns with the pilot training, with pilot experience, with aircraft maintenance, and definitely with airline operations. And all of these issues have to be investigated and they have to be reviewed. To ignore any possible factor or to jump to any predetermined conclusions about those factors, it creates the risk of future accidents that could have been prevented by full and thorough investigations. And the final thing is we have to avoid politicizing our aviation system. Safety is it's absolutely at the core of what every pilot, every flight attendant, every air traffic controller, engineer, repairman, manufacturer, every inspector, every operator, and every regulator strives for each and every day. It's the reason why in the last decade here in the United States, there have been nearly 7 billion passengers on 90 million commercial flights with one fatality. That's a heck of a record for the FAA and the aviation community in the United States. It's a heck of a record to be very proud of. And certainly one loss of life is one too many, but that unprecedented safety record is due to the safety culture of the aviation industry, which includes a collaborative and non-punitive approach to certification and safety oversight. And we must uphold that strong safety culture and that reputation. And over the next few months, the FAA and Boeing are going to work hard at ensuring that the safe return of the 737 MAX, that it's safely returned to service, and their progress is obviously going to be very closely monitored, not only by this committee, but by the world, the entire world. But I can say without any hesitation that I believe that the acting administrator of the FAA, that I believe him when he said that the FAA will return the 737 MAX to service in the United States only when it determines, based on the facts and technical data, that it is safe to do so. Only then will it happen. So again, I want to thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing, and I would yield back the balance.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Want to now welcome our witnesses. I'm not going to read titles and biographies, but we'll have Sharon Pinkerton from A4A, Captain Dan Kerry of Allied Pilots, Captain Chesley Sullenberger, retired pilot, Sarah Nelson from the AFA-CWA, and Honorable Randy Babbitt, former Administrator, FAA. And recognize each of you for 5 minutes. Without objection, though, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since it has been made part of the record, we request you to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And first, we'll recognize Sharon Pinkerton for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves. Thank you for having this hearing today. My name is Sharon Pinkerton. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy at Airlines for America. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today to talk about aviation safety. Nothing's more fundamental to this industry than a commitment to safety. You know, U.S. carriers have led the world in aviation safety for decades, and we are very proud of that record. But the events that are bringing us here today have humbled us. These are sobering tragedies, and as an industry, as Americans, as human beings, we mourn the lost lives on Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. I want to convey not just our condolences, but also our industry's commitment to support policies and actions that are going to help ensure the highest level of aviation safety. Our industry doesn't simply shrug off failures like this. We fixate on root and proximate causes in order to learn from what happened and take that knowledge to better ensure the safety of our passengers and crew. As an industry, we're constantly challenging ourselves to meet and exceed the highest levels of safety. It has to be said that travel on U.S. passenger carriers remains exceptionally safe. As the committee knows, because you've played a role in shaping this system, we've flown almost 8 billion people on 94 million flights over the last 10 years. And in that time, there was one fatality. And although that is too many, our record is remarkable. Commercial aviation remains the safest mode of transportation by a wide margin. But we cannot and we will not rest on the status quo. And that's our promise to you and to the families that are here. As you know, several authorities are still reviewing the 2 overseas accidents. It's important to allow those investigations to conclude before rendering final judgment. But we know from experience that there are usually several factors, not just one, that contribute to any accident. While we wait for the findings and recommendations, Boeing has taken responsibility and pledged to make improvements by updating the flight control software. Our response must be deliberate, rely on facts and data before we form recommendations, which is how the FAA is approaching these accidents. The FAA's safety and regulatory framework is the gold standard in the world, and our safety record is the proof of that. We have a culture of collaboration in aviation where everyone throughout the system, public and private employees, manufacturers, carriers, everyone is encouraged to speak up and speak out if they see a potential safety issue. The industry does work closely with the FAA, and we believe that a transparent and collaborative relationship is critical to making the safest aviation system in the world even safer. Our safety record is the result of deliberate and systemic improvements over many years. We've moved from an early 1990s, very forensic approach, looking back to determine what happened, to a very proactive and predictive data-driven approach to determine that anticipates and prevents accidents before they occur. It was really in the mid-90s that the industry and the FAA started to rely more on data from the plane, data from our employees, data from the controllers. The Commercial Aviation Safety Team, or CAST, was formed to give all of the players, labor unions, operators in the FAA, manufacturers, a seat at the table to share information. And the 1996 FAA bill provided protection to entities to help create a safe environment for that information sharing. The Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing Program, otherwise known as a SIAS, represents the overarching program that connects all of the FAA's safety programs and shares data from across those programs and uses that information to identify risk and develop mitigation strategies. What's extraordinary about how this industry approaches data sharing? It's unique to the aviation mode. Aviation data is not proprietary. We don't compete. We communicate and we collaborate when it comes to safety. With respect to the impact of the grounding of the MAX on passengers, there were 3 U.S. carriers that were operating the MAX when the aircraft was grounded in March. Those carriers immediately began reassigning existing resources to minimize disruption to passengers. Fortunately, carriers were able to accommodate over 99% of impacted travelers through rebooking and rerouting. Of course, the question still remains, when will the MAX be returned to service? And the answer is not before the FAA, working with our pilots, certifies that it's safe, and not before adequate training is performed. The FAA, working closely with our pilots' unions, our technical experts,
Speaker, I'm
international
going to
regulators,
have to ask you to wrap up.
and Boeing, is engaging in a rigorous process. I'll close by saying safety is something that our industry doesn't take for granted, and we never will. For us in the aviation community, our hearts break for the family members. However, we take solace in the fact that there are dedicated professionals, both public and private, that will do everything they can to maintain our tremendous safety record and build on it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Captain Kerry, 5 minutes as well. Be sure, everyone, that you're pulling the microphone right up to your mouth. Captain Kerry, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Mr. Graves of Missouri, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Mr. Graves of Louisiana, honorable members of this committee. My name is Captain Daniel Kerry. I am a 35-year career pilot at American Airlines. I am also president of the Allied Pilots Association, the largest independent airline pilots union in the world. I also serve as a member of the board of the Coalition of Airline Pilots Associations here in Washington, a trade group representing 32,000 professional airline pilots whose concern is safety and security of the traveling public. The piloting profession is in my family. My father and 2 uncles were fighter pilots in World War II, one of whom lost his life in the service of our nation. My father was an early pioneer with Trans World Airlines, and my daughter pursues a professional career as a commercial pilot today. I'd also like to recognize the family of Samia Stumo, who's here today. God bless you all. Samia was a young woman as well, pursuing her career and young life, and tragically lost her life on ET-302. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, what brings us together today is the tragic accidents of 2 Boeing MAX aircraft. We owe it to those 346 souls and the flying public around the world to make sure these kind of events never happen again. In my 35-year career at American Airlines, I've operated as captain on 5 different types of airplanes, 28 years on Boeing aircraft. I'm here to tell you, Boeing designs and engineers and manufactures superb aircraft. Unfortunately, in the case of the MAX, I'll have to agree with Boeing CEO. They let the traveling public down in a fatal and catastrophic way. As said here earlier by some of the speakers, we will await the conclusion of the several investigations underway around the world before we determine the final judgment of the MAX disasters. There are a few facts we do know. The MAX was designed to provide the same aircraft feel as the 737. This was intended to minimize cost to Boeing's customers by allowing the MAX to be certified as a 737-typed aircraft. This led Boeing engineers to add the MCAS system. Many mistakes were subsequently made by Boeing, as the MCAS was designed as a federated, not an integrated, aircraft system. As a single port of failure, this design meant that the redundancy of the system went back to the captain and first officer of the aircraft. The huge error of omission was the fact that Boeing failed to disclose the existence of the MCAS system to the pilot community around the world. The final fatal mistake was therefore the absence of robust pilot training in the event of an MCAS failure. The most important issue now is the question of the airworthiness of the MAX aircraft. I believe the Boeing engineers have indeed found the problems to the software issues facing the MAX. And therefore, the redundancies are now embedded in the aircraft in the event of a misfiring of the MCAS going forward. However, at APA, we remain concerned about whether the new training protocol, materials, and methods of instruction suggested by Boeing are adequate to ensure that pilots across the nation and around the world can operate the MAX fleet with absolute and complete safety. In fact, during a meeting with the FAA in April, the FAA officials highlighted a critical checklist that Boeing directed pilots to use to recover the MAX after an MCAS firing. The FAA official stated that this critical checklist had not been validated since 1967. This is an example of why the APA has integrated into the Flight Standardization Board comments calling for the review, improvement, and training of critical MCAS misfire recovery checklists. I don't have all the answers today, nobody does, but I do have some questions. First, is the FAA sufficiently independent of the manufacturers as to provide legitimately rigorous audit of manufacturing, design, and engineering? Second, should a federated system, which may lead to an unrecoverable event, be certified ever by the FAA? Third, should the FAA aircraft certification, as for example, a 737 designation from 1967, have a timeline or a sunset date? Finally, is the FAA sufficiently equipped to ensure that pilot training protocols are vigorous and robust as aircraft become more and more sophisticated? Mr. Chairman, these are among the questions that I hope this committee examines, and of course, there are many others. Unfortunately, as pilots know, improvements in aviation are too often, written in the blood of the unfortunate victims of these airplane accidents. But all of us, pilots, flight attendants, airline companies, manufacturers, the executive branch of our government, and Congress, owe it to the victims at the highest level of diligence to make sure these kind of accidents never happen again. This is a global aviation crisis of trust and will require global solutions to restore and bolster culture and respect.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
The pilots of the Allied Pilots Association are humbled and proud to be part of this noble cause. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Captain Chesley B. Sullenberger III for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and other members of the committee. It is my honor to appear today before the Subcommittee on Aviation. Like Americans and many others around the world, I'm shocked and saddened by these two awful tragedies and terrible loss of life. I just met the parents of 24-year-old Samia Stumo, and I saw in their eyes the incomprehensible immensity of their loss. These crashes are demonstrable evidence that our current system of aircraft design and certification has failed us. These accidents should never have happened. The accident investigations of these crashes will be not completed for many months, but some things are clear. Accidents are the end result of a causal chain of events, but in this case, the chain began with decisions that had been made years before to update a half-century-old design. Boeing added MCAS, but the existence of it was not communicated to pilots until after the first crash. Some have said that even though MCAS software had flaws, the pilots on these flights should have performed better and been able to solve the sudden, unanticipated crisis they faced. Boeing has said that they did not categorize the failure of MCAS as more critical because they assumed that pilot action would be the safeguard. From my 52 years of flying experience and my many decades of safety work, I know that we must consider all the human factors of these accidents and how system design determines how many and what kinds of errors will be made and how consequential they will be. These two recent crashes happened in foreign countries, but if we do not address all the important issues and factors, they can and will happen here. We owe it to everyone who flies, passengers and crews alike, to make sure that pilots will be able to handle an unexpected emergency and keep their passengers and crew safe. But first, we should design aircraft for them to fly that do not have inadvertent traps set for them. I'm one of a relatively small group of people who have experienced such a crisis and lived to share what we learned about it. I can tell you firsthand that the startle factor is real, and it's huge. It absolutely interferes with one's ability to quickly analyze the crisis and take effective action. Within seconds, these crews would have been fighting for their lives in the fight of their lives. In both 737 MAX accidents, the failure of a single angle of attack sensor quickly caused multiple instrument indication anomalies and sudden, loud, and in some cases false warnings. creating major distractions, masking the cause, and would have made it even harder to quickly analyze the situation and take effective corrective action. I recently experienced all these warnings in a 737 MAX flight simulator during recreations of the accident flights. Even knowing what was going to happen, I could see how crews could have run out of time before they could have solved the problems. Prior to these accidents, I think it is unlikely that any U.S. airline pilots were confronted with this scenario in simulator training. We must make sure that everyone who occupies a pilot seat is fully armed with the information, knowledge, training, skill, and judgment to be able to be the absolute master of the aircraft and all its component systems and of the situation simultaneously and continuously throughout the flight. As aviation has become safer, we can no longer define safety solely as the absence of accidents. We must do much more than that. We must be more proactive than that. In essence, we must investigate accidents before they happen. We should all want pilots to experience these challenging situations for the first time in a simulator and not in flight with passengers and crew on board. And reading about it on an iPad is not even close to sufficient. Pilots must experience it physically, firsthand. If we don't learn from these crashes, if we just file the findings away on a shelf to gather dust, we will only compound these tragedies. We will make the loss of lives in these accidents even more tragic if we say that these were just black swan events, unlikely to happen again, and decide not to act, and instead just protect the status quo. Only by discovering and correcting the ways in which these tragedies occurred can we begin to regain the trust of our passengers, flight attendants, pilots, and the American people.
Thank you, Captain Sullenberger. And now recognize Sarah Nelson, Ms. Nelson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, and the entire committee for the opportunity to testify on the issues surrounding the Boeing 737 MAX. As a 23-year flight attendant and international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, AFL-CIO, representing nearly 50,000 of aviation's first responders at 20 airlines, I am here today because the public looks to flight attendants when it comes to aviation safety. We are aviation's first responders and last line of defense, and we have more public contact and interaction than any other profession within aviation. And the public trusts us to look out for their interests. We are all here today because 346 lives were lost on Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. This hearing room has many people in it who have lost loved ones due to tragedy in aviation. We can see their faces, feel the warmth of their smiles, and try with all our strength to carry on without them. Some days we do this with more success than others. But we also know with certainty that if there was anything at all that we could have done to prevent their lives being cut short, we would do it. This reality is inescapable. We know that aviation safety and security is written in their blood, and we must ensure their sacrifices mean that we fully examine the chain of events that led to their deaths so that this is never repeated. As I stated on March 13th, shortly after the grounding of the 737 MAX, lives must always come first. But a brand is at stake as well, and that brand is not just Boeing, it is America. What America means in international aviation and by extension in the larger world more generally, that we set the standard for safety, competence, and honesty in governance of aviation. Under various agreements between the FAA and other countries or groups of countries, foreign authorities agree to work with the FAA to accept U.S. certification of aircraft and manufactured aeronautical products. This system of international aircraft certification has been built upon global recognition of the FAA and its statutory mandate to maintain safety at the highest possible level. This is now under question, and it means that the FAA must ensure that it has taken all measures to assure the safety of the 737 MAX within the U.S., as well as all countries who must also approve the aircraft for its return to service. Both Boeing and the FAA seem to recognize the need to win back public support and the importance of involving stakeholders in the process. Over the course of the last several months, our union has witnessed a chastened tone from Boeing and what appears to be a real desire to regain trust. This is critically important if remaining questions are to be answered and stakeholders around the world are to be convinced that the 737 MAX is safe to fly. It is significant that the FAA has formed the Technical Advisory Board and that they are engaging the rest of the world and conducting a rigorous review of the software fix and full accounting of human interaction with the functionality of the plane. The fix must be rigorously tested and communicated with utmost transparency and required training. And while this is not an area of expertise for our union, flight attendants must be assured that operators, pilots, regulators, and independent assessment is confident in the safe return to flight. We put our own lives on the line when we return to flight, and we will do so knowing all has been done to ensure safety. We are heartened to receive assurance that Acting Administrator Elwell is working in close coordination with worldwide regulators in returning the MAX to service. Mr. Elwell's time in leadership has not been easy, and yet he is tasked with securing the confidence of regulators around the world and the traveling public, and we need to do all we can to help him. Questions remain, but we believe that the FAA's engagement of all stakeholders is the right leadership approach. We encourage both Boeing and regulators to continue efforts with stakeholders to answer all the questions and communicate fully the lessons learned, along with any necessary changes in procedure. Flight attendants take our role in aviation seriously. And while we're not yet there, we look forward to assuring the public that it is safe to return to flight. We continue to receive questions from the traveling public about the 737 MAX, and there is confusion about the progression of the 737 aircraft models. It's common for crew to receive questions when working the 737 NG about whether or not the aircraft is safe. This signals a fundamental question about the progression of the 737 aircraft models and whether or not the MAX should have been designated as an entirely new aircraft type. And this is the type of question that has to be answered if we can regain public confidence. I should also note that we do not have one question from flight attendants asking when we will regain the flight hours that we have lost with the 737 MAX, because safety is non-negotiable. We believe that we need to take a close look at ODA and the process for certification, and we also think that this committee's work to ensure a review of cabin aircraft certification in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 is critically important. We believe that funding and ensuring a government shutdown never happens again is critically important, and we support H.R. 1108 to ensure that doesn't happen. Again, we commend this committee for its diligence in promoting aviation safety, and we look forward to the continued leadership from Acting Administrator Elwell in promoting a 737 MAX return to service that inspires confidence among aviation workers, our counterparts around the world, and the traveling public. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Randy Babbitt, former Administrator, FAA, for 5 minutes. Good to see you again, Randy.
Pardon me. Good morning. Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Graves, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member also Graves, and to the full members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today and discuss the return to service and certification issues surrounding the Boeing 737 MAX. I would also like to take a second and offer my condolences, heartfelt condolences, to the family and the friends and the loved ones of the passengers and the crew members and all aboard, Lion Air 610, as well as the Ethiopian Flight 302. In interest of disclosure, not in my original testimony, I have had the opportunity to fly the Boeing simulator yesterday, and I flew both scenarios of the old software and the new software. Obviously, this came after I turned in my testimony. But I've had a pilot's license from the time I sold it in 1962 to date. I've also been an aviation safety advocate for over 40 years, so I do bring some background and I believe some understanding to accident investigations and changes that have been made subsequently to improve aviation safety and efficiency over the last 40 years. As president of ALPA in the 90s, I championed the one level of safety, which essentially melded the regulations under Part 121 into the operations of Part 135, and that provided a vast improvement of regional carriers' airline safety standards. And while serving as the FAA's administrator, the Program for Aviation Safety, Information Analysis and Sharing, known as ASIAS, was introduced and today provides a collection of data that has dramatically improved safety by having stakeholders and operators reporting and sharing problems and issues that they encounter, operational issues, and they report these before they become accidents. We also began to purposely focus on collaboration with all facets of aviation operations to be more forthcoming with mistakes, errors uncovered, and other issues. And we've also asked that the FAA consider to be less punitive in order to inspire more voluntary disclosures. Following the tragic accident in Buffalo, I called on the industry and the organizations representing the professional airline pilots of the country together for a call to action focused on professionalism. We revisited a lot of past actions and then entered into a partnership with the industry to actively address concerns raised by the discoveries uncovered in the Culligan Air Flight 3407 tragedy. We identified steps to strengthen and improve pilot training, hiring, testing, and all the practices surrounding aviation at the regional airlines and major carriers. Participants agreed on best practices and changes to them for pilot record checks, development of pilot mentoring programs, and reassessing rules for pilot fatigue, flight, and duty time, and this time based on scientific research about fatigue. And we should acknowledge that the FAA's mission is to provide the safest and most efficient transportation and aerospace system in the world. In an aviation system, data is our friend. 90 million flights, 7 billion passengers carried over the last decade in the U.S. is the most incredible safety record the world has ever seen, and it's also not symptomatic of a flawed safety structure. In 1970, to take a look back, in 1970, we were losing a hull in this country every 6 weeks, 8 accidents a year. And looking back today, we haven't lost a hull in 10 years. That's quite a dramatic recommendation of the dramatic efforts that continuous safety improvements will bring you. Our nation's system of certification of aircraft has been evolving also for over 60 years, and it must continue to evolve and improve. But as we move forward with increased reliance on automation, the linkage and the interface between man and the machine must also evolve. It's imperative that pilots have a full and complete understanding of the automation of the equipment that they operate and the systems designed to protect the operational envelope of the aircraft. But of equal importance is ensuring that pilots have the full training, operational knowledge, and understanding of those operational boundaries and the limitations of those systems. Automation and training must also keep improving on maintaining situational and operational awareness of what equipment and automation is actually controlling. Pilots need to understand the operational realm in which automation takes control of an aircraft and be aware of the situation calling for the action, as well as the full range of possibility that that action can be. No pilot should ever be surprised by an event that takes place in an airplane in which they're certified. That includes training exposure to all phases of the operational envelope, as well as the safety protections that are designed to protect the operating envelope and protect it from excursions. In closing, a retrospective look into the introduction of service shows that assumptions were made by Boeing and accepted by the FAA, and design changes incorporated that should have been more rigorously tested and flight crews better educated and trained in reaction to a new safety protection system that Boeing had introduced. History tells us that this is not a new problem, but in fact has been part of aviation history, unfortunately, going back to aircraft such as early jets like the Comet and metal fatigue, later Douglas DC-10s, Lockheed Electra's engine mounts had to be redesigned.
Thank you.
Douglas pitch trim compensators, all of which had to be resigned, but those aircraft did finish out their lives with successfully after the required modifications. I'm comfortable in closing that the FAA and Boeing working together have rigorously evaluated and reevaluated the design along with revised training requirements that will ensure
You're going to have to ask you to wrap up.
to service by the 737 MAX. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Babbitt. I appreciate it. Appreciate everyone's patience with my impatience as well. And I'm going to now move to member questions and recognize members for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. My questions are going to largely focus on the training and training standard the training recommendation that would be necessary to get to return to service, and I just want to explore that. Captain Sullenberger, although you weren't specific, you're more generalized, is it your position that there ought to be required simulator training for pilots on the new, for the software fix for the 737 MAX before it's returned to service versus a computer-based simulator training?
Yes, it's critical that we address all the issues. It's critical that pilots, as soon as possible, experience in a full motion level D simulator, and not just a part task trainer, all the effects of the MCAS system, and also all the other things that likely have not been trained either at all or since initial qualification on the airplane, like unreliable airspeed, manual trim operation, including manual trim operation at very high indicated airspeeds, where it may require either two hands or the efforts of two pilots to actually move the manual trim manually, or in some cases it may not be possible to move the trim manually until air loads are reduced. They need to develop a muscle memory of their experiences so that it'll be immediately accessible to them in future, even years from now, when they face such a crisis.
Okay. I'm just going to ask our staff, and we don't need to get into the technical details of what D-level versus B-level training is, but if staff could do a memo for the subcommittee members, that's kind of some basic stuff, so we don't need to spend time here talking about those differences, but if you could do that for the members so we understand that. Captain Kerry, do Allied pilots have a different position or the same position as Captain Sullenberger?
Thank you, Chairman Larson. While Captain Sullenberger's recommendations are certainly the best case scenario, logistically, American Airlines has 4,200 pilots on the 737 MAX. Southwest would have 9,000 737 pilots. We're in favor of the scenario that Captain Sullenberger described in a video concept, and we do 9-month training protocols. So our pilots will receive a CBT program.
CBT means what?
Computer-based training. Okay. And then the video training program of the scenario that Captain Sullenberger suggests. And after that, we have 9-month training program, which would enable every American Airlines pilot to go through that simulator scenario and that muscle memory exercise within 10 months.
It's a little bit different.
May I add that a spot scenario might help get pilots in the simulator more often and sooner. I understand that that's a logistical matter of great importance, but the point is there are other ways to accommodate more pilots sooner than waiting for their recurrent training cycle to occur.
Okay. Ms. Pinkerton, from the airline's perspective, how does this, where do you come down on this training issue to get to return to service?
As you know, I'm not a pilot, so I don't have this kind of expertise, but we are relying on people who do have the expertise. The FAA is utilizing the Flight Standards Board on this very topic, and we are confident that working with those independent experts involving our pilots' unions, they will come to the right decision about what kind of training is needed, and we will provide that training.
So you're, from the airline perspective, you're saying that the Flight Standards Board giving the recommendation of the FAA is where this committee should look for advice on how we should think about the training necessary to go to return to service?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Babbitt, have you considered this decision, and could you give us your views on it? Yeah, have you considered this question and give us your views?
Yes, I think that, some training, as I said in my testimony, I don't think a pilot should ever be surprised by anything that happens in an airplane. And this is a pretty substantial piece, and I had the opportunity to see it both ways. However, I think it's a very similar maneuver to other things that happen in the aircraft. My suggestion would be to evaluate it, and quite often, I know ALPA was often involved with the FAA and carriers to decide what training was needed. And I think a consortium of a group like that could make a recommendation. Perhaps it's give them computer-based training, but maybe the next cycle of checks that you should be exposed to it.
Thanks. And President Nelson, I have a question for you. I just want to affirm what you said. Flight attendants are the ones answering the questions from the flying public about is this that plane or is this a different kind of plane? And so I just want to emphasize the FAA needs to continue to include you all in the outreach, because you're the ones answering questions of the flying public more so than any other group of people. So.
I appreciate that, and I think that there's been a recognition of that we have to be fully involved for there to be a successful return to flight.
Great, thank you. I understand on the Republican side, we're going to go with Mr. Mitchell first, so, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I share the concern, and I can't imagine the pain of the families of the victims of both flights. I'll meet tomorrow with the family of Ms. Stumo to talk about this, share with them. They can share with me their concerns. Couldn't schedule it today. They have a need for answers to the problems, what caused this. They have a need for responses sooner than later. I am concerned. I've talked with Chairman Larson about the delays from the FAA responding to questions that were asked several months ago. We haven't had much response from FAA on some simple questions. The design of MCAS, the review and certification process of MCAS, what role Boeing had versus what roles were undertaken by the FAA to need to be reviewed. It should be clear to us, however, that what happened in both flights were cascading issues, errors, whatever term you want to put on it. One fed another. It's a chain of events that if any one or more, a couple of those things hadn't happened, we would not have had the outcomes we had. I raised the last hearing that also included in that is the qualifications and training of the pilots, both in terms of on MCAS and in general. One thing I think the families deserve is full information, not having bits and pieces wander out or have pieces used for political process has been noted. Captain Kerry, you've made more than a few headlines of late by releasing portions of an apparently secret recording made in November. I'd like to ask you some questions about that. First, and I'd like your responses also for the record if you're unable to respond. Who made that recording, sir?
I did, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Did the board of directors authorize that or know in advance you were making a recording?
No, sir.
Did you tell Boeing officials you were making that recording prior to the meeting or subsequent to that?
No, sir, that's not required under Texas law.
I'm glad you're aware of that. Are you aware that, I'm sure you are, that in April, you issued a press release fully confident in the Boeing 737 MAX and its capabilities? This is your organization, correct?
Yes, sir.
Shortly thereafter, and this is deeply concerning to me, that then portions of the tape were released in the midst of a union campaign being it's everyone's problems, that it's Boeing's fault. They did it. Bits and pieces of information. What's the value of that to either the system or the family in doing that? We don't have complete information on it yet. So explain to me what would be what warranted that.
So the APA is founded on the safety. Safety first always, and safety is not for sale. Boeing came to visit us on November 27th of 2018. We were ready to record the meeting if we thought it was a PR meeting and not a sincere exchange of technical data. 10 or 11 minutes into the meeting.
Stop a second. Hold on. It wasn't we, because you said they were unaware. So you
we, my team, my subject matter experts at APA, my safety committee chairman, and my training committee chairman, and our subject matter experts, my team, we decided if we thought Boeing was insincere at the meeting, we would record the meeting. Boeing has a history with the 737 rudder control back in the 90s, a U.S. Air accident, which Captain Sullenberger is very familiar with, of being dishonest or less than forthright. Talk about honesty, sir. I made FOIA requests on November 28th, 2018, on all MCAS data between the FAA and Boeing. To date, we have not had one piece of data arrive.
Well, I've not had a response either to requests I've made to the FAA, so I share your frustration.
Thank you, sir.
But let me make a point, which is your board supports the equipment, and then shortly thereafter in May, you...
Sir, our initial press release...
Let me finish the question, sir. That's the way it works. You then release portions of a tape, portions of it. I'd ask you for the record here that you submit the entire tape so we can hear it.
The entire tape has been submitted to the committee, sir. It's been submitted to Chairman DeFazio. We submitted a entire transcript of the tape to Chairman DeFazio and the tape itself.
Do we have that? Okay, I'd like to hear that. Let me make one final comment as we're almost
We will
out of time.
certainly, APA will certainly supply you, sir, with a copy of that written transcript and the tape.
I'd appreciate that. One final comment before I get gavelled out here. I believe, as I said earlier, it's a cascade of errors. One of the questions I posed in the last hearing, which continues to trouble me a great deal, is the pilots of Ethiopia Air, their hours, give me a great deal of question. The pilot in the right seat could not fly under our standards here. We need to look at the ICAO standards versus our standards in North America for pilot qualifications and training and reconcile that along with all these other questions because there are a series of them. And until we get those answers, I respectfully ask, let's not give out bits and pieces because it's damaging.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Turn to Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes.
Captain Kerry, it says in your testimony, 737 MAX designed to provide the same aircraft feel to the pilots as the 737. This was intended to minimize the operating cost of Boeing's customers by allowing the MAX to be certified by the FAA as a 737. And then in Captain Sullenberger's testimony, he mentions that it disturbed the engine mounts, disturbed the natural aerodynamic stability of the 737 in certain conditions. I got it. What are those conditions, and why was this necessary? Or was it just about avoiding certification and pilot training? What are those conditions? Can either of you answer that? Quickly. We got only 5 minutes.
I would like to know and hear from Boeing why MCAS was necessary. Was it to meet a certification standard, or was it to achieve a common type certificate that would not require additional training for pilots and
Okay, so
airlines?
we don't know the answer to that question. That's a pretty critical question.
I do not know the answer.
Okay, anybody there know the answer?
Sir, there's some speculation or there's some data coming in from Boeing engineers that have contacted us that there may be some negative dynamic stabilization problems with the aircraft, which required Boeing engineers to add the MCAS system to the 737 MAX 8 and 9 design.
Okay, we
If I could comment?
We really need to quickly.
If I might comment, Boeing's description to me was that the airplane at high angles of attack had a softer elevator feel than the original aircraft, and they wanted it to have more feel.
But it wasn't dangerous, so the pilots would be trained to deal with that.
That's correct.
But,
and that's quite
if
common.
they hadn't experienced it, they wouldn't be trained to deal with it.
It's quite common in the industry. For example, Airbuses, I've flown every Airbus made.
Well, I don't want anybody, if you could, avoiding, things that cost a little bit of money or delay the deployment of an aircraft that could lead to pilots who are not informed as to all the characteristics of that aircraft, which you already said earlier. The MCAS, people should be informed of this system. Now, there's also, because of the pilot discussion, in Captain Sullenberger's, he said that there were many false warnings simultaneously.
Yes. As opposed to older aircraft designs where cockpit instruments were essentially standalone devices and information was not shared between them, and a fault in one could be easily identified and isolated and disregarded. Now, in modern airplanes with higher levels of integration, that's higher levels of electronic interconnectedness and sharing of data between devices, it's now possible, as happened on these cases and in the June 1st, 2009 crash of Air France 447, where a single errant data bit, a single fault, a single failure can now have cascading effects rapidly through multiple systems and create a condition of multiple warnings, some of them false. It's difficult to sort it out because of the startle factor, the workload, the task saturation, to identify the root cause. And it can be contradictory, ambiguous, confusing, and ultimately overwhelming.
Would a disagree light have helped in that situation?
It might.
It might.
With so much going on, such loud warnings, so many other disparate indications, they might have missed it, but had they seen it, it might have been that one
Kerry,
clue
looks
they
like
would
you want to
need.
say something there. Did you, or are you just taking notes?
Yes, sir. I would like to comment. Excuse me, Captain
Quickly.
Sullenberger. The MCAS system is a federated system, which means it's not integrated into the control laws and logic of the computers on the 73 MAX aircraft. Again, the failure was that Boeing did not disclose the existence of MCAS to the pilot community around the world. Therefore, robust training was not conducted. the last line of defense in the MCAS system. When we asked Boeing at the November 27th meeting in Texas what the last line of defense was with the MCAS firing and firing and firing until the aircraft stabilizer was full nose down, they said the pilots. Well, they didn't ever tell us the system existed, so therefore, we did not have robust training.
Okay.
And let me add, I think some false assumptions were made about how the system would operate, how it would be noticed or become aware of by pilots, and what human performance would be in those conditions. I think it was a false assumption to think that before MCAS's existence, much less its operation, was even disclosed to pilots, that they would interpret this
I want to say one other quick thing here
as a
before my
runaway
time
trim
is.
syndrome scenario.
Thank you. And that leads to some of Ms. Nelson's testimony they wanted to get to, which is questioning engineering assumptions. She questions the engineering assumptions that went into the battery on the 787. They were wrong. She's questioning the engineering assumptions that went into the MCAS system as they radically changed it on the 737 MAX and didn't disclose it. And then also evacuation standards, which will be an ongoing concern of this committee, which are only computer simulated. Computers are not humans. They're not human factors. They don't anticipate everything. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And now recognize for 5 minutes Ranking Member Graves of Missouri. Okay, thank you. Then we'll go with, looks like we got Representative Balderson from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the folks here testifying today. I appreciate your time. My first question is for Mrs. Pickerington. You note that the following grounding of the 737 MAX, the airline industry employed a variety of mechanisms to cope with the disruptions. Southwest has the most 737 MAX airjets in operation of any carrier in the United States. Southwest is also the largest passenger carrier in Central Ohio. Can you discuss how Southwest and A4A member carriers have accommodated the loss of the 737 with minimal disruptions for service?
Yes, as I mentioned, the A4A carriers that had the MAX grounded have done several things. Rebooking passengers, rerouting, but in addition to that, they've had to make systemic changes. They're utilizing spare aircraft. They're doing things like delaying optional enhancements like souped-up Wi-Fi and painting the aircraft. Unfortunately, we have had, our carriers have had to completely eliminate some service or take flights on markets that are more lightly flown and reduce frequencies. But for the most part, carriers have been able, like I said, to accommodate 99% of folks. We are anticipating that despite the capacity drawdown that Southwest, American, and United have had to do, we're going to see a 3% increase in seats overall this summer. And that's with other carriers filling in the capacity and different aircraft coming online also that are providing that capacity.
Okay, thank you very much. My next question is for Captain Kerry and Captain Sullenberger. You both mentioned the need to ensure pilot training protocols are vigorous and robust, especially as aircraft are becoming more and more high-tech. I agree that passenger safety should always be the most important aspect of our aviation industry and that our pilots should receive the best possible training. Are there any obvious or necessary changes you believe should be made to licensure requirements or pilot training?
Thank you, Mr. Balderson. I was interested to know that Boeing afforded Captain Babbitt, former Captain Babbitt, retired Captain Babbitt, the opportunity to utilize their simulator, their 737 MAX simulator, full motion down in Miami yesterday. Boeing invited two of our pilots who are here today who have a cumulative over 5,000 hours on the Boeing 737 aircraft to use that simulator on June 5th. Shortly before that appointment, Boeing rescinded that invitation. So it's curious to me, while Boeing is working on this fix, they don't want the people who fly it to actually see it. So as far as the APA getting behind the software changes and the FAA certification, recertification of the 737 MAX return to service, we would like our safety committee chairman and our safety committee and training experts to be permitted to fly the 737 MAX simulator. The only one in existence right now in North America is in Boeing's facility in Miami. However, there is another one. It's in Addis Ababa. It belongs to Ethiopian Airlines.
Captain.
It needs to be a priority for every manufacturer, for every airline, to provide all pilots and flight attendants with all the information that they need to operate their equipment safely, to understand it. As complexity increases, it makes resilience harder without the proper knowledge. And the most important trait that every technology must have is that it be intuitive. It has to make sense. It has to be additive to one's training, one's experience, and not contrary to it. And so, especially for things that operate in a surprising or counterintuitive way, we must be made aware of it and its complications and its implications. We must experience it firsthand in the simulator before we face a crisis in flight with an airplane full of passengers and crew.
Thank you both very much. I yield back my remaining time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Balderson. Representative Lipinski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this hearing. It's clear, we all know, we all agree, we need to get to the bottom of what happened with these two crashes so that we can provide answers to the families and friends of the victims, but also to do all we can to try to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. I want to focus my questions on the certification process. I had said at the hearing we had a few weeks ago, I think that there was something went wrong. We need to figure out what that is. We're still waiting for answers in investigation here. But I want to ask more general questions about the ODA program. I want to start with Captain Sullenberger. In your testimony, you pose a lot of important questions for Congress to consider with respect to the certification process. Do you have any specific recommendations at the moment with regards to general reforms of the process?
It's important that oversight include accountability, or it means nothing. First, it's important that FAA be provided the budgets that are sufficient consistently to fulfill its responsibilities to the safety of the traveling public in terms of staffing, in terms of providing those who oversee certification with the subject matter expertise to be able to do their jobs, especially as technology improves, and especially in this global aviation industry. It's often very difficult internationally for FAA to have the budget, the staffing, and the subject matter expertise to do the oversight that's necessary, in particular for foreign manufacturers. It's important, as Captain Kerry has said, and Ms. Nelson has said, that the FAA have the independence to do their jobs without political or economic influence. It's important that whistleblower protections be in place and that the safety culture in our organizations, FAA and manufacturers, be strong enough that those who have the integrity and the courage to insist on the highest design standards for the safety of the public not be overruled by supervisors with other agendas.
How do we do those things?
Pardon me?
How do we do those?
We start with the organization itself, and we start with how the incentives in each organization are aligned. Are they aligned for expedience, or for economy, or are they aligned for consistent application of best practices? Are people hired and promoted and receive bonuses based upon production numbers or based upon quality, safety? We get what we measure. We get what we reward. And right now, in important ways, the incentives are not aligned toward consistent public good sufficiently in all our organizations. Key members and leaders of each safety-critical aviation organization must have subject matter expertise, and in some cases, they must not be only engineers, they must also be pilots. So they understand in a first-hand way the implications of design choices. Every design involves compromises between strength and weight, performance and cost. We need to make sure that these decisions are made in a fully informed fashion, in a transparent way, and that communication about them is communicated effectively at every level, so we know what risks are and why we're taking them. We also must look at faults not just individually but in combination. I think that may be a part of what happened here, that there was not a full appreciation of the magnitude of the risk to a single fault to these systems and the lack of knowledge among the operators.
I want to give Ms. Nelson a chance to address this in the last minute I have. Thank you.
Okay, so we have talked with engineering experts who have advised us that a culture of safety would engineer a plane from a clean sheet, and a software fix is not a fix to a manufacturing problem. Now, they have also assured us that it is possible to have a software fix to make the 737 MAX safe. But starting from a place of the FAA turning at the same time to say that the manufacturers and the airlines are their customers, as opposed to providing that direct oversight and creating the Organization Design Authorization Program, ODA, there were many warnings that over time this program would lead to a deterioration of safety. And that is because there is not the rigorous oversight throughout the process that may have led Boeing from the very beginning to make very different decisions here because of the oversight that would have been involved if we were to return to the FAA oversight prior to ODA.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize Representative Spano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. We appreciate it, and thank you to the family members for being here. Again, I want to as well wish you all the best and express our condolences to you and to tell you that our prayers are with you. And so thank you for being here. I'd like to ask a series of questions to the panel, if I may. Just have you respond, if you would, by raising your hand, all right? And then I'll acknowledge which one of you, for the record, I'll indicate which ones of you have answered in the affirmative. How many of you would describe yourselves as a safety advocate? And let it reflect that every single person on the panel has raised their hand. How many of you are pilots? Let the record reflect that Captain Kerry, Captain Sullenberger, and Mr. Babbitt are pilots. How many of you are licensed airline pilots? Let the record reflect as well that Captain Kerry, Captain Sullenberger, and Mr. Babbitt are licensed airline pilots. How many of you are aeronautical engineers? Let the record reflect that no one on the panel is an aeronautical engineer. How many of you have designed a commercial transport aircraft? Let the record reflect that no one on the panel has designed a commercial transport aircraft. How many of you are software engineers? Let the record reflect that no one on the panel is a software engineer. How many of you have designed software for commercial transport aircraft? Let the record reflect that no one on the panel has designed software for commercial transport aircraft. How many of you have certified a commercial transport aircraft? How many of you have certified a commercial transport aircraft? Let the record reflect that Mr. Babbitt has certified a commercial transport aircraft. And finally, how many of you have conducted an accident investigation or been an official party representative to an accident investigation? Let the record reflect, raise your hand. Okay, let the record reflect that Captain Kerry, Captain Sullenberger, Ms. Nelson, and Mr. Babbitt have been an official party representative to an accident investigation. Thank you for that. And I follow up with a couple of questions. First of all, Captain Sullenberger, you indicate in your statement that we can, quote, unquote, no longer define safety solely as the absence of accidents. From a layperson's perspective, to me, safety is preventing an accident. So could you unpack that statement for me? Why is it that we can no longer define safety as the absence of accidents?
The short answer is because we've been able to make them much more rare. And if we do only that, we're not doing our jobs. We need to look at all the near misses. We need to look at all the unresolved systemic risks and latent conditions. We need to do a lot more of what we're currently doing audits, relying upon self-reporting of safety incidents. All the little things that become links in a causal chain that might lead to an incident or an accident.
Understood.
And
Thank you.
to intervene and break that chain, to resolve these risks and these conditions before they can lead to harm. And we've been doing that for many years. We are doing it more and more, but we need to do it even more than we are. If we had, we might have been able to avoid these two most recent ones.
My next question is for Mr. Babbitt, and then if any of you want to follow up with a response as well. Can you just briefly speak to the challenge that we face to ensure public safety in a global aviation landscape? Like, so for instance, what are the FAA's duties and responsibilities? What are our responsibilities as policymakers? What should our objectives be? What should the regulatory framework look like when we have many variables around the world that we cannot control?
That's an excellent question, and it presents quite a challenge to the FAA or any regulator. And the challenge is you have to make assumptions on the base level of education that you have for pilots. And if you say, for example, two pilots sitting here, and you say, do either of you put your hand up if you have an ATP? And we both put our hands up. We've got one captain down here who's got 35 years with American Airlines, and the one sitting next to me over here has an ATP and a 172.
Because you allowed me to interject, so what's an ATP, just for the record, if you clarify?
I'm sorry, air transport pilot.
Thank you.
But you can get an air transport pilot rating in a Cessna 172. That doesn't compare to Captain Kerry's experience or Captain Sully's experience. But yet they both have ATPs. So we make these assumptions. We need a little more information when we design airplanes and say, well, they have to have an ATP. Well, okay, they have an ATP, but we need more than that. And I agree with Captain Sullenberger that, the data mining that we have today, SIAS that I mentioned in my testimony, is providing incredible data where everyone can report without repercussion. And we use that data to prevent accidents. We'd rather investigate data today than we would accidents. It's that simple. But we also need to have a better understanding of the assumptions that the FAA, the manufacturers, because the assumptions we make in the United States may not be the assumptions made in Germany or France or other places.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, you'll back.
Recognize Representative Johnson of Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to express my condolences to the friends and relatives of the victims of these two air crashes, and thank you for your presence today. Captain Sullenberger, you, in your testimony, stated essentially that this 737 platform, which had been around for 50 years or so, was updated with the design of the 737 MAX, which pretty much sits on the same platform as the 737. But the 737 MAX has larger engines, and these larger engines, because of ground clearance, those engines on the MAX were required to be mounted higher and further forward on the wings. Is that correct?
Yes.
And because of that design need, the new engines actually reduced the aircraft's aerodynamic stability in certain conditions, which therefore inspired the folks at Boeing to address that issue with adding a software feature called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, also known as MCAS. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the MCAS system operated automatically, causing the nose of the plane to be pushed down without pilot input if conditions warranted.
Yes.
And the condition that warranted it would derive from the operation of one angle of attack sensor. Something that would happen to the sensor would cause the MCAS system to operate and push the nose down without pilot input.
Yes.
And if that angle of attack sensor failed in some way, it could result in a problem in the operation of the aircraft. You're pushing the nose down, that means the plane's going to go down, correct?
Yes, and not just once, but repeatedly.
And the MCAS system was not a system that was revealed to the airline industry and thus to the pilots prior to the first aircraft disaster in the Philippines.
My understanding is that it may have been revealed to some airlines, but to my knowledge, no airline pilots around the world knew of its existence before the first crash.
No pilot around the world knew that the MCAS system could thrust the nose of the plane downward. They did not know that, and so therefore they had no training in terms of how to react to a sudden nosedive by the plane. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, would you say it again?
A pilot without knowledge of an MCAS system in the plane, flying a 737 MAX, pilot not knowing of this MCAS system, and now the plane is suddenly, the nose of the plane is headed downward. You're not trained, or no pilot was trained in how to react to that occurring prior to the crash in the Philippines of the 737 MAX.
That's essentially correct. As I understand it, the assumption on the part of Boeing and the designers was that pilots, even though they did not know of the existence of the MCAS feature, the software, that they would somehow interpret this repeated nose-down movement as being a runaway stabilizer procedure, which would be something that they were familiar with. But it's, as I said, demonstrably evident that at least 2 professional airline crews were unable to do that.
Was the FAA notified of the MCAS addition to the 737 platform prior to the crashes?
My understanding is that at some point they were made aware of the feature, but that they were not aware of the changes to the operation of the feature prior to the first crash, that it had been redesigned to activate with greater movement each time it activated, and it would activate until the full range of motion that could be achieved was achieved. In other words, it would act repeatedly until the nose was forced as far down as it could go.
Thank you, Captain Sullenberger. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Massey's, I'd recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming today. Captain Sullenberger, do you think that better trained pilots or more experienced pilots should have been able to handle the situation in the malfunctions in the Lion Air and Ethiopian airline crashes?
Congressman, the first thing that we have to remember is that we are all, as humans, subject to hindsight bias. And it makes it very difficult for us to know with certainty what one might have done, suddenly facing an unanticipated situation that we now have knowledge of. I think that it's unlikely that other crews would have had very different experiences or performed very differently than these 2 crews did on their accident flights prior to knowledge of this system, certainly in the first case.
Was
not having practiced it in a simulator since then.
Wasn't there a crew on the same plane on Lion Air that experienced a malfunction prior to the crash?
Yes.
And how did
at least one apparently experienced this and was successful, but obviously 2 were not. I don't know what the probability of success would be, but at least 1 did, and at least 2 did not.
May I comment, sir?
Sure. Let me ask you a question first, Captain Kerry. Are your members trained on runaway trim procedures? U.S. pilots?
It would depend on what aircraft type they've been on and how many years they've been with the airline. The simple answer would be yes, at some time in their career they were trained on a runway stabilizer situation, either on the aircraft they're flying or a previous model. What I would like to comment, sir, at your pleasure, the Lion Air airplane that did successfully land after the MCAS experience was fortunate enough to have a third pilot in the jump seat, and that pilot recognized the malfunction and led to the safe landing of that aircraft.
If the other pilots had the same training as the third pilot, would they have recognized it?
It may have just been fate that the third pilot was there. While you have to remember, sir, and members of the panel, this is a sudden, violent, and terrifying event. This airplane's pitching up and down rapidly and violently. There's bells, warnings, and clackers sounding. Communication is difficult. The third pilot in the jump seat, those stab trim wheels are right in front of that observer. And that pilot was fortunate enough to recognize the malfunction.
Let's talk about your members and colleagues. Would they know how to respond to that situation or how to identify and respond to runaway trim?
I would have to completely concur with Captain Sullenberger's remarks. In this situation, I believe that some crews would have recognized it in time to recover, and some would not have.
Mr. Babbitt, can you tell us about your experience in the simulator and encountering a similar situation? What was that like?
It was a very educational experience, I'll say that. I think I would agree with Captain Sullenberger that any of these events, all of us up here have experienced different emergencies, and they're very attention-getting. And sometimes, you might have been focused over here. I had the advantage, as did Captain Sullenberger. I knew what was going to happen. I've read, and I knew what the procedures should have been in the old system. I knew what the procedures were in the new system. And so I was able to follow the procedures. But essentially, I had training. I had been briefed as to what the reaction of the airplane was going to be. And nevertheless, it is any emergency. When a fire bell goes off in the aircraft, I've had engine fires. It's quite discerning, and one of the first things you do is stop the noise. In this case, you can't stop the noise. The stick shaker continues to go, and we figured out, I mean, my experience in Boeing's, we had one going and one not. That would tell you you've got an indicator problem. But yes, and then the new software fix was, I think, a very good one. It obviously limits the amount of authority given to the pitch down. And it only does it once. I mean, you either fix it or you don't, and it is a runaway stabilizer trim.
I'd like to ask one more question
Sure.
real quick of Captain Sullenberger. I think you're spot on in your statement that we can no longer define safety solely as the absence of accidents. We need to look at the near misses. But how do you balance the pilots not wanting somebody looking over their shoulder versus going back and looking at the near misses? And if he could respond, I'm done asking questions.
Yeah,
Give you 15 seconds.
The key to that is trust. When pilots trust that their professional observations, self-reported, will be de-identified and used only for safety purposes, they are willing to make those kinds of safety reports that can only come from them and not from somewhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize Representative Titus for 5 minutes, and on our side, Mr. Allred would be after Representative Titus. Representative Titus, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you all have said, this investigation is very important for the future. For the past, maybe it gives some solace to those who have family members or friends who are lost, but it's not going to bring back those lost lives. So if we think about the future, I would wonder if now that you are having greater scrutiny by the FAA, now that you're looking into what caused these problems, now that you're revisiting the ODA, have you discovered any other shortcuts that Boeing or some of the airlines might have taken that we don't know about and haven't caused accidents yet? Mr. Babbitt?
No, the ODA process has been around since the beginning of time and airplanes. I mean, the only pilots I know that didn't go through it were Orville and Wilbur. Everybody else has had to turn over their designs if they wanted things certified. And, the process works. I mean, you simply don't have the manpower to absolutely watch every piece of design. Boeing has over 40,000 engineers. The FAA has 1,400. And you work hand in hand, and the ODA process is the same in the United States as it is at the EASA, which is the European. So I think what we need to do, one of the things that it's incumbent upon us now as we move forward with increasing technology is understanding and training pilots to appreciate more and more of the safety envelope is protected by automation, meaning that this is not the only airplane that will help you recover. Captain Sullenberger flew the A320. If that airplane gets too close to a stall, the airplane pushes up its own power. If you get going too fast, it pulls the nose up for you. It does a lot of things, and these are all things to protect the safety envelope, but the pilots need to have absolute training and understanding of what
I understand all that. We've been through all that, but that doesn't answer my question. Have you discovered any other problems that we just haven't made the news because there hasn't been a crash?
No, I think
that's reassuring.
Obviously, if I knew what those problems might be, I don't anticipate there were any. I think Boeing has done it respectably. They've built wonderful airplanes over the years, and I put in my testimony, I think they made a bad assumption as to what they needed to tell people. They assumed this system was one everyone was familiar with based on similar systems in the aircraft, and they were incorrect.
Okay, thank you. I hope you're right. Thank you.
And Ms. Titus, thank you. I would like to see more FAA oversight of foreign repair stations. This is vital to the future of aviation. More and more aviation maintenance, heavy maintenance, is being outsourced overseas to countries like El Salvador, Brazil, China. As much as we would like to keep these jobs in the United States, and that's certainly our agenda, the economic reality is these maintenance facilities are going overseas, and we'd like to see a very robust oversight of these facilities.
May I comment also to clarify something that Captain Babbitt said? ODA is actually a fairly recent revision of the previous DER system, and one of the major changes in that is that the FAA no longer chooses their designees. They're chosen by the manufacturer. And so, again, the incentives are not aligned as consistently toward public good with those kinds of choices being made and depending upon who their supervisors are.
Would you like to comment, Ms. Nelson?
And I think the rationale behind that was if you have 40,000 engineers, you know who the better ones are, you know ones who should have risen to the management of the projects. The FAA doesn't know these people at all.
But
they have oversight of them. And they work in parallel with them. If you've been part of a certification team or certification flights, which I have been, you have an FAA pilot in one seat and you have a Boeing pilot in the other, putting the airplane through the paces. If you look at the records, the FAA has flown the airplane just about as much as the Boeing pilots have in testing.
I appreciate that, but you say you lack the resources to have adequate oversight. I believe that's true from all I've heard from FAA over the last several years, and there's going to be a tendency by someone who works for a company reviewing what that company's doing to be more positive than somebody who's objective and outside. I mean, that's just a fact. I would ask very quickly, Ms. Pinkerton, some of the airlines are now reconsidering the use of the 787 MAXs. They've ordered thousands of them. Some of them are changing out their whole fleet because they want to keep the same plane, and you understand all the economics of that. Have you heard any of the airlines addressing some reconsideration of this or how they're taking that into account with the grounding of all these planes?
Well, I've certainly seen the reports. Those are commercial decisions that each carrier is going to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allred, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first express my deepest condolences to the families of those lost in these two crashes. I extend my condolences to the families who are here and those that are not. I want to do what we can to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, not only with the MAX, but with future aircraft and iterations of aircraft. To that end, I want to begin with you, Captain Kerry. At our May 15th hearing, I raised my concerns to Acting Administrator Elwell after reading a report in the Dallas Morning News regarding your meeting with Boeing, that the FAA was not made aware of the concerns of your pilots. Moving forward, What role do you think pilots should play in alerting the FAA of concerns like those that you raised in that meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Allred. First of all, I would like to thank Acting Administrator Elwell. He's been quite progressive in allowing us contact to his office and his professionals. Going forward, we would like to see our subject matter experts, our 737 pilots in our safety and training program at the Allied Pilots Association, invited to future certification proceedings on all future designs. We have the 777-900 coming down the chute from Boeing shortly. This will be the first commercial aircraft with folding wings. Do we want that to be certified on the original Boeing 777 certificate from 1996 or whenever it was? And this goes back to the timeline or the sunset of a certificate as we're speaking. The 737 is operating on a 1967 certificate. So we absolutely would like the stakeholders, the flight attendants, the pilots, the engineers, and the maintenance personnel to be involved in future certification with the manufacturer and progressively with the administration as these designs come to commercial use.
After the designs have already been introduced, are you confident in the processes to raise those concerns now?
I believe I am confident in the ability to raise the concerns through the ASAP program, the safety reporting program, the whistleblower program, and forums like this, public forums that you so graciously put forward. I would like to say, to answer a question that was raised earlier, the Allied Pilots Association only endorsed the safety of the American Airlines version of the MAX because we were one of 2 airlines in the world to purchase the optional dual AOA system. So we professed our confidence in our version of the airplane. I called the president of the Southwest Pilots Union and said, heads up, you guys don't have the redundancy that we have.
Well, you raised a point that I want to follow up with Captain Sullenberger. In your written testimony, you state that, quote, whistleblower protection must be strong and effective, and if it is not strong enough, we must strengthen it. In your experience, do you believe that current protections are sufficient? And if not, what can be done to ensure that employees are freely able to come forward with their concerns?
It is apparent to me that it is not sufficient. I think there are those who need to come forward and they need to feel free of recrimination in order to make sure that the truth is known.
Mr. Babbitt, same question to you.
I can tell you at the FAA, when I was there, whistleblower reports were taken incredibly seriously. I, in fact, established an entire department to ensure that they were heard, that they had the protections that were needed, and the follow-ups were made. It's a very robust system. And to my knowledge, I know of no one who has come forward later after leaving or anything and said, geez, I tried to be a whistleblower and no one would listen to me. That doesn't happen at the FAA, not at least in my tenure there.
Good.
I think there may be a problem within the manufacturing side, the commercial side. For example, Boeing has what they call a Boeing's ethics department. So if an engineer or an employee raises a vital concern, if it has economic impact to the corporation, they may be coached or counseled.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I have about 40 seconds left, and Captain Kerry, I just want to ask you one more question from your written testimony. You state that there's only one standard of safety and training, and that, quote, simply put, Boeing does not produce aircraft for U.S. pilots versus the rest of the world. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, sir. We have to get away from the days of the American pilot machismo and the Top Gun movie. Pilots, Ethiopian Airlines flies a plane into Washington Dulles every day from Addis Ababa, and they have been doing it for years. They have a proud aviation culture. They were founded by TWA in 1945 and managed through 1975. They're very proud of the fact that Emperor Selassie was the only head of state from Africa to attend JFK's funeral because he had a Boeing aircraft that brought him here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now recognize Representative Johnson of Texas and followed by Representative Davids from Kansas. Representative Johnson, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me express my appreciation for all of the witnesses being here, and especially the family representatives. We care deeply about airline safety. For one thing, all of us get on a plane every week, going and coming home, and so we're as concerned about American safety as any other safety around the world. I live in Dallas, Texas, where we have DFW and Love Field, and both airports have airlines very involved in this area, and it does cross my mind often how above board we are with the examination of the planes and the agencies in charge, and wonder sometimes if some laxity might cause a little slip-up. I know that we have a very, very safe aviation activities, but I wonder if each of you could tell me anything that would give us a little bit more assurance that we're headed in the right direction for making sure that safety is a number one concern each time a plane is involved. It really, this kind of accident gets your attention. And we want to be supportive of whatever it takes to ensure more and more safety. We have more and more air traffic and more technology involved. Change does come. So I am very concerned as an old mind who does not move as fast as some young ones, I am basically very concerned about safety in aviation. We see more and more traffic. So each of you will take some time, if you will, to give me some of your thoughts of what we need to focus on to ensure that.
Congresswoman, I think that you can rest assured that our aviation system is the safest in the world. I've been an observer of this industry for 20 years. I worked on the Hill and did oversight of the FAA. I worked at the FAA, and now I represent the airlines. And I can tell you, the dedicated people that are at the FAA and that are in the airline industry, safety is absolutely our top priority. And when accidents like this happen, we take them incredibly seriously. We go back, we look, and we try to be better the next time. So even though we've had a decade of a perfect safety record, albeit that one terrible fatality, we recognize that we have to be better. And that's why I mentioned in my testimony the types of programs that we have right now allow us to predict and prevent. We identify trends. I can assure you that when the FAA, and I'll tell you what the good sign is. I think Sarah Nelson mentioned she's noticed a chastened attitude and motivation. When something like this happens in the aviation community, we redouble our efforts. We don't rely on our perfect record from the past. We know we have to get better, and we're committed to doing that.
Thank you.
I'd like to note that I agree wholeheartedly with Sharon, and I think that there is no doubt that everyone across the industry, whether it's regulators, operators, or the frontline personnel who make the airlines fly, are absolutely committed to safety and can tell you without a doubt that that is the foremost thought on their minds. There are some things that we can learn from this, though, and things that we can do better. And one of them is fully funding FAA personnel and making sure that we are competitive with the private sector for the certification engineers who are working at the FAA. And I think that we can also make sure that the reporting systems that Captain Kerry was talking about that help us continue to analyze how we're doing, look at near misses, look at potential problems where employees had a distraction with their safety duties. And they're able to do that because they can report these issues without a punitive response. So that has been under attack in recent years, and in our experience has been diminished somewhat, and we have had to fight very hard for the continued programs that ensure non-punitive reporting systems so that all of the employees can identify when they see an issue. And I would say that those two issues especially could be addressed in this time, both the funding and also the continued support of the reporting systems that allow us to continue to analyze the safety systems and keep us safe.
Thank you, President Nelson. Thank you, Representative Johnson. I recognize Representative Davids for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses who are here today to testify, and thank you to the families. My condolences on your loss, and condolences to those who are not here today. The first thing I would like to do is just to acknowledge that all of us, we've heard from you, we've heard in previous testimony and hearings that we've had, that all of us recognize that safety is the underlying most important foundational piece of our aviation system, not just in this country, but around the world. And as leaders in that space, I know that all of the folks here are putting that as a top priority. I can tell from your testimony, not just your verbal, but also your written testimony and the meetings that I've had with folks who are also part of the FAA. And I think that one of the pieces that we have to also keep in mind is that pronouncements from anyone, whether it's manufacturers, stakeholders, members of Congress, or other people who are performing oversight about what any causes might have been of these accidents, are premature until we get the results of the investigations. And I've appreciated all of you bringing that up and continuing to remind folks of that. One of the things I would like to start off with is actually a follow-up from the line of questioning that Mr. Balderson was on earlier, which is to ask Mr. Kerry, you mentioned that the invitation for the folks from Allied Pilots made on for a June 5th simulator training was canceled. I'm curious if you could tell us what the reasoning for the cancellation was?
We're still trying to determine that. We initially received an invitation to go down to the Boeing simulator at Miami, 737 MAX full motion simulator, and Captains Goldberg behind me and Captain Tazier were going to participate in a flight review of the MCAS system at Boeing's invitation. The invitation was withdrawn. We're trying to get some simulator time either at Boeing. I mentioned earlier Ethiopian has a simulator we're trying to get to use, and also a correction to my earlier statement, there are also 2 737 MAX simulators in Canada. So if Boeing will not renew their invitation, we will certainly go purchase time at one of those other carriers.
So at this point, there hasn't been a rescheduling of the invitation?
No, that's somewhat upsetting to us. I mean, we're the largest airline in the world, and we would like a fair take at reviewing this MCAS scenario in a muscle memory scenario, as Captain Sullenberger described earlier.
And then I'd like to, Mr. Babbitt, I would like to hear your thoughts on the funding question and making sure that we're keeping FAA properly funded. Both what was your experience, and then if you can opine on where we're at right now. I'm not sure if you feel comfortable doing that because you're not currently the administrator, but I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Yep. Thank goodness for that. Thank you. The funding is always an issue. You come in with a robust, we have always an enormous amount of things that people would like the FAA to undertake and do. You simply don't have the funds, and so prioritizing what you need to do, and obviously what is at the fulcrum of that prioritizing is safety. And I think, and I didn't get to answer Mr. Johnson's question, but I think the biggest fear we have is, and funding will help alleviate it, but the biggest fear that I have is complacency. We have a system that is incredibly safe, and therefore a lot of people say, well, geez, it's running great. Why do we need to do anything else? Well, we need to do anything else because we're always breaking new boundaries, pioneering new areas, understanding new technology, and we have to evaluate those things. And remember, the FAA's task is not to design the systems, it's to design the safety boundaries that the system has to operate in. it's sort of like baseball. The commissioners set the rules. The players have to play by those rules, and that's what we do. That's what the FAA does. And so prioritizing, and I guess the best thing I could suggest is that we make certain that when the FAA does, in fact, prioritize, they share those thoughts with the committees, which I know we do.
Thank you. And finally, I would just say that the concept of oversight is something that is our duty under the Constitution. We also have the duty to make sure that we're properly funding all of our safety, especially aviation, but all of our safety mechanisms in this country. So that's on Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize Representative Craig of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Again, as all of us, I want to express my sincere condolences to the families and friends of the victims of the Boeing 737 crashes. We take this responsibility in this Congress incredibly serious, so thank you all for being here with us today. Before I came to Congress, I worked in a highly regulated space, the medical technology field, where we heeded very strict compliance and reporting requirements to disclose aftermarket or post-market issues that were encountered by physicians, by hospitals, by many stakeholders with our devices. It was a government system, the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System, sometimes referred to as the MAUDE database. Mr. Pinkerton, I found the voluntary reporting programs you mentioned to be incredibly interesting. And I wanted your thoughts on whether we should have a more structured approach rather than a voluntary reporting system so that, as Captain Sullenberger said, we resolve these risks before we encounter an event. If you would speak to that, and then I'm going to ask a number of you also to speak to whether you think the post-market reporting requirements are adequate from an FAA perspective.
Thank you for the question. And with respect to the structure of our safety programs, I think the voluntary nature, and it'll be great to hear from our union partners on that, but the voluntary nature of it is part of the beauty of it. And Congress has passed statutory protections for voluntarily coming forward. And frankly, that's been a linchpin of our safety management systems and all of these data sharing programs. So I would, I think everything, and we certainly welcome any scrutiny of these programs. I think it's always good to ask the questions, but those programs are working remarkably successfully right now. With respect to the FAA standards on parts, I think they're welcome scrutiny, and that's the beauty of the oversight that you're taking seriously and that you all are performing. The IG, the Secretary has asked for oversight. Again, I think the scrutiny is welcomed. The standards are working very well right now.
Captain Kerry or Sullenberger, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, we're quite proud of the fact that the Allied Pilots Association, in partnership with the FAA and American Airlines, established the first aviation safety reporting program nearly 25 years ago. It's now known as ASAP. And this has been tremendously successful in averting disasters over the last 25 years. And this program started with the pilots at American Airlines, but now it reaches out to the other stakeholder work groups within the airline industry at every airline in the country.
Let me just add that I agree with Captain Kerry and his mentioned earlier about some of the maintenance issues with foreign repair stations and their oversight. Those in particular are troubling. More and more, over time, airlines, for economic reasons, have outsourced much of their heavy maintenance that used to be done in-house by their own employees, supervised by their own employees. Often there was an FAA overseer on the site. Now to overseas locations where if the FAA even has the budget and the staff to make a foreign visit, it's virtually impossible for them to arrive unannounced. There's also a continuing problem within the industry of counterfeit parts. People trying to reuse parts or use parts without a proper provenance, where you know with certainty its history from the manufacturer to its delivery on site and to use in an airplane. So there still are some ongoing systemic issues that have never been resolved.
Ms. Nelson, you mentioned in your testimony the 2006 NTSB results of a study, safety report on the treatment of safety-critical systems in transport airplanes. The NTSB concluded that existing decisions made during design and certification process practices were not subject to ongoing risk assessment and consideration of new information from aftermarket operations and maintenance of aircraft. Do you believe that this 2006 NTSB recommendation has been addressed and implemented by the FFA?
This has been addressed. I would say yes, it has not been fully implemented, and my assumption for the biggest reason that it has not been fully implemented is the funding to carry out those recommendations.
It comes back to funding. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Recognize Representative Stanton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Larson. I appreciate it. Thanks for the witnesses for being here and being patient with this committee. Sorry for coming in and out. Obviously, we serve on multiple committees. My first questions are for former FAA Administrator Babbitt. Mr. Babbitt, Captain Kerry has questioned whether a sunset or termination date for FAA aircraft certification, particularly for those like the 737 designation from 1967, should be incorporated into the FAA certification process. As this committee examines the certification process, with your decades of FAA experience and as a pilot yourself, do you think this is an idea worth considering?
Well, they actually do. Those certifications, the original certification in 1967, applied to that airplane, obviously. And what you look at as maybe 2 years later, we have a new engine we put on that airplane. Do we recertify it? Not really. It has maybe the same thrust, and so and the parties work together. The airline, the manufacturer, they say this doesn't significantly operate the aircraft differently. It doesn't feel any differently. The pilots do need to understand what the new engine limitations might be, but that's that. Those are every time there's a significant change made, it is evaluated by the FAA. I guess the point we should get to for this one is: were the changes made to this aircraft substantial enough that it should have dictated, wait a minute, it's got a different wing, it's got this, it's got that. Maybe we should have another type certificate for this airplane. And that's a valuable, or something worth considering.
Thank you very much. As you know, Boeing advanced the 737 MAX as a fourth generation of the 737. This had several benefits for Boeing: saving money, gave them a jump start on their design and engineering work, and required less pilot training. But most importantly for Boeing, it allowed the company to apply for the same common type certification, saving considerable time in getting the aircraft off the ground. In your opinion, should the FAA have considered, under these circumstances, should the FAA have considered this a new aircraft model rather than a variation of an existing one?
They did consider. I'm certain that they looked at it, and there's an entire matrix of changes that you go through, and these are typically shared. I know in the past, most of the pilot unions involved get to look at that matrix, and whether it's certification, minimum equipment, things like that. But what's important to remember, I've heard several times that if this was a new type certificate, it would be very, very expensive. Not necessarily. If the old airplane simply has one new feature, and we say, well, we're going to have to give a different type rating for this, all you're going to have to train in is that difference. And a great example is in the Airbus aircraft. To transition from an A320 to an A330, which is a dramatically different airplane, it's 4 days of difference in training. If you had never flown an A320, it would be a 3 or 4 week course.
To your knowledge, has the FAA ever denied a manufacturer's application to treat an aircraft like a variation of an existing aircraft?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. My question is now for Captain Sullenberger. Captain, thank you for being here. I want to explore with you a question raised in Captain Kerry's testimony on pilot training. As aircraft have become more and more technologically advanced, is the FAA equipped to make sure that pilot training is sufficiently rigorous to handle the potential scenarios that could arise?
I have concerns, Congressman, because over many years, pilots have been given less and less detailed information, especially in the documentation, the manuals that we have access to, even online. So it becomes harder and harder for those of us who really want to understand in a deep way exactly how these machines operate, where the surprises are, where the dark corners are, where the counterintuitive features are that we have that might bite us, that might be a trap for us if we are unwary. And going back to the certification issues for a moment, I wanted to address quickly one more, I think, unappreciated change that occurred with the MAX, having stretched this airplane even more than the previous version. The result of that, because of the legacy short landing gear and the geometry that affords for the nose angle and takeoff and landing, the speeds for takeoff and for landing have been increased significantly over previous versions, about 20 knots, I understand. That's 23 miles an hour, which slightly increases the risk of a runway overrun. And when you're operating at airports like Burbank, like Chicago Midway, like LaGuardia, that are short runways constrained by obstacles, in some cases by water, that becomes even more of a consideration, especially if the runways are wet or contaminated by snow and ice. And that's yet one more compromise that's been made in this latest stretch to the original design.
All right, thank you, Captain. I have more questions, but my time is short, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carball. You're recognized for 5 minutes. And I ask that you apologize to Mr. Brown.
I apologize to whoever I need to apologize to. Thank you all for being here, for giving us your time and to share your thoughts and testimony with us. Captain Kerry, thank you for your time again. I know you have a very distinguished career as a 35-year captain with American Airlines and spent time in Africa training African pilots. Based on your experience training non-U.S. pilots, why is it important for a company like Boeing to create an aircraft for pilots around the world and not just U.S. pilots? Are there any improvements you think the FAA can make to evaluate pilot training?
Boeing's a national treasure. I worked as a kid in a machine shop on Long Island making parts for the aircraft industry. That's how I paid my way through flight training. The pilots in Africa or Europe, America, we're lucky here in the United States because we have a robust military and we have a pool of well-trained military pilots. We also have a thriving corporate and commuter regional airline industry. So again, we have a constant assembly line of well-trained, experienced pilots. That doesn't exist in small nations around the world like Greece or Portugal or Ireland or even the United Kingdom. They have to use ab initio trainings. Programs. Ethiopia. When I was in Africa in 2012 and 13, I was training the presidential pilots for the president of Equatorial Guinea on their new Boeing 777 aircraft. And I spent a year there. And we maintained a relationship to use the training and maintenance facilities at Ethiopian. Ethiopian has a world-class maintenance and training facility. They can do overhauls on Boeing aircraft, just like we do at Tulsa Tech, American Airlines' largest training maintenance facility in the world. Going forward, I'd like to see more training. When I was hired 35 years ago, we trained every 6 months, recurrent training. Captain Sullenberger can attest to that. Now the FAA has given what they call a single visit exemption, where airlines can retrain their pilots every 12 months. American Airlines happens to do 9-month cycles. I think we should go back to more training. More training leads to a safer sky. One fatality in 7 billion is one more than we need. As Captain Sullenberger said earlier, we need to prevent accidents from the factory floor to the sky, and we can do it.
Thank you. Mr. Babbitt, you oversaw the FAA after the crash of the Air France Flight 447 and the Colgan Air Flight 3407. In your testimony, you mentioned our nation's system of aircraft certification has been evolving for over 60 years and must continue to evolve to improve. What are some of the improvements that FAA can make to the current certification process? And 2, from your experience, are there any lessons learned that we should keep in mind as we work through the issues facing the 737 MAX?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that what the FAA could do has been mentioned by several people here. You're certainly going to need experts in the various areas of new technology that we're seeing. We're now seeing artificial intelligence induced into decision-making in aircraft. And the data behind those needs to continue to expand. All of that takes money. So, in terms of subject matter experts, increasing where we need them and anticipating that is going to be very important. As I said in my testimony, data is our friend. You know, what we did coming out of 3407 or the Air France, we took that data and made changes based on it. Unfortunately, we don't have much data as of today for either the Lion Air or the Ethiopian accidents. We know the basics of what happened, but we don't know, and our own NTSB will eventually look at that data and give us more information, which will provide a roadmap for us to, okay, we need to expand and do a better job in these areas if we're going to take the lessons learned from that data.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Representative Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to offer my condolences to the family and friends of those who died in the two crashes involving the Boeing 737 and MAX 8. I want to thank the panel not only for being here today and your testimony, but your work as aviation safety advocates. A lot of your testimony, a lot of the questions have focused on training, and I don't want to be redundant, so I've been able to check off a lot of my questions. I just want to clarify a few things. The simulators. Captain Sullenberger, you mentioned a level D. I think you categorized it as a full field simulator. I understand there's one in the United States, 2 in Canada, 1 in Ethiopia. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Are there other simulators that either, that may not provide full field but allow for ample training on emergency procedures, system failures, mechanical failures?
Well, Captain Kerry would know better than I, but there are, of course, simulators for previous versions, including the 737NG, the immediate predecessor to the MAX. But that, of course, wouldn't be able to replicate the activation of MCAS.
Okay. That's correct.
The cockpit is a busy place, even in normal flight conditions, and when there's a flight condition that triggers an emergency indicated in an instrument or some other indicator, it gets really, really busy. I just want to sort of explore. I come out of the Army aviation community where, flew back in the 1980s, so we still had sort of steam gauges in the OH-58, and I know we've advanced considerably in every airframe, rotary wing and fixed wing. But can you give us a sense of, for the 737, how many emergency procedures are in the documentation, either a pilot's manual, an operator's manual, for mechanical or system failures? Give us a rough estimate.
I have my 737 subject matter experts behind me. They inform me there are hundreds, sir.
There are hundreds. And of those hundreds, is there sufficient simulator time to train on those hundreds?
We train, at American, we train every 9 months, and we go through the major ones, the ones that would be the most difficult for a pilot to handle.
And now, and of course, the training challenge with the MCAS is that we didn't, as Captain Sullenberger mentioned, we lacked the information that it was on board. But are there other automated systems, and I think this is a follow-up to a question that was asked by Representative Titus, are there other systems that create automated systems?
Mr. Brown, be sure you're getting in the microphone there.
I'm sorry, yeah, I just couldn't see the witnesses beyond Mr. Napolitano. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Are there other automated? It's the design flaw of the room. Don't worry. No, you're fine. Are there other automated systems that present similar challenges in terms of? And I'm focusing on the simulator. That there's adequate simulator time to train on.
Well, as far as the 737 MAX goes, the MCAS is the only federated system which is not integrated into the flight control laws and logic. So this would be one that is unique in itself. And well, as we talk about this in a static matter, you're an aviator yourself, we have to remember that as the pilots are trying to regain control of this aircraft, they experience +2 positive G-forces and -0.7 negative G-forces. As you know, sir, those are extreme forces on the human body while you're trying to read a checklist, perform duties, move switches, move controls, not to mention the human suffering that was obviously heard behind the cockpit door. So this was a terrible situation to put an aircrew in.
So, Captain Sullenberger, you mentioned that, on the level D, there need to be more simulators or certainly more simulator time. Are there any other missing components in the training programs? This is you mentioned simulators. Are there any other missing components?
Yes. And some things we're doing to some extent already, but we need to do much more. I've seen in my career a huge tsunami of change in technology and in training. And I've seen certain trends. One we mentioned already, the reduction in the information about their systems and their airplanes that's now available to pilots compared to years ago.
Let me just jump in because I got 10 seconds. Does Congress have to legislate this, or is this something that it can self-correct in the market or with the FAA?
I think it needs FAA direction. I think the airlines need incentives to do more training, not just in what we consider batting practice of one-off events, but really in an operational flying scenario, give them multiple challenges that they've never seen before, and where they must have a creative reserve to use what they know, adapt it, and apply it in a new way to solve a new problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I concur.
Thank you. So just so we know, in order of the members that are here, we're going to go with Norton next, then Lynch, then Napolitano, and then Payne. That's the order that we have right now. Representative Norton, 5 minutes.
Appreciate this hearing, but I particularly appreciate the families who are here. The least we owe you are our condolences. Actually, sometimes committee learns more from the newspapers than from any place else. And I'm looking at and perhaps this is best for the pilots, I'm looking at a New York Times piece that indicates, it's a Wall Street Journal piece, that 25% of people who fly airplanes want to avoid the MAX. 38% say they weren't sure. The flying public doesn't know what to do, in other words. But the FAA has signaled that it's preparing for flight trials for the proposed 737 MAX enhancement as early as this week, and preparing to take an important step toward returning the 737 MAX service by late summer. Now, we know it will require the FAA endorsement and indeed foreign regulators as well, but I need to ask you, is this the pace that you would expect given what Boeing has gone through in the last several months? Is this the pace to get back into service?
Thank you,
summer?
Congressman Norton. I would expect that Boeing and the FAA have this as their top priority, as do the air carriers who have these airplanes on order. We have 24 MAXs in. We had 24 MAXs in service at American Airlines, and now I believe there's 6 more that are already off the assembly line, and that's just one airline. These aircraft are needed. They're needed for passenger service. We want them back in service.
You think that this pace is to be expected?
I think that the Boeing Corporation and the FAA is capable of getting this airplane back in the sky by the end of the summer.
I think the flying public would be very pleased, given your expertise, to hear that. But I'm now interested. I've become more interested again from what I read in the press and what happens in the factory. Now, the information I have is from the North Charleston plant. Now, the 737 MAX was designed and assembled there, but the information we have really bewilders me because it's on the 737 Dreamers. So the verdict seems to be in on that, and that the employees from the plants were whistleblowers, and as 5 years ago, the agency did not allow the employees from the plant to certify the aircraft to FAA. That's 5 years ago for the Dreamers. The Dreamers. And it bothers me because the MAX is also manufactured there. The employees, the whistleblowers, said that they believe the strong demand for this other plane, on which the information is in, the 787, had pushed Boeing to make to quickly turn out jets as it raced to meet deadlines. So I'm trying to find whether there's something endemic in the culture that we ought to watch out for, given what we already know now about the 787 Dreamers, and what do you think, therefore, of the pace in light of what we know about the Dreamers, which were also manufactured at this South Charleston factory?
Congresswoman, if I can respond. From the airline perspective, we have no interest in a rapid pace.
You certainly have some interest in it.
Well,
obviously, Boeing is losing money. It needs to get these planes up in the air.
We have a much stronger interest in the FAA and Boeing working with our pilots union in getting.
I'm asking about
this right.
I'm asking about this plant, which also is a plant that produced the MAX. Does anyone have any misgivings about that? Yes,
Congressman, I have seen those same reports, and it gives me great concern that with both the 787 manufacturer and the manufacturer of the Air Force tanker, the KC-46, there was some debris left in some bays of the interior of the aircraft that could possibly chafe wiring and cause future issues, and that Boeing has become aware of this and is aggressively trying to get to the root of the problems with the manufacturing process, so no foreign objects remain in manufactured aircraft.
Thank you very much. I recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their help this morning, and I certainly want to join my colleagues in offering my condolences to the families of the victims, and thank you for your presence here today. Earlier in the hearing, the ranking member mentioned that we should avoid politicizing this issue. And I do agree that over a long period of time, our aviation system had been extremely safe, a stellar record. And as someone who gets on a commercial airliner at least a couple of times a week, and as someone who has very warm relations with many of the pilots, I've been doing this for 20 years, so I've come to know a lot of the pilots, flight attendants, machinists, people who work at the airport. My brother-in-law works on the runway at Logan Airport in my district. They all take enormous pride in that long and stellar safety record. On October 29, 2018, that long, excellent record was severely damaged when Lion Air Flight 610, a Boeing 737 MAX, crashed into the Java Sea at about 450 miles an hour, killing 184 passengers and 5 crew members on board. That long record of excellent safety operations was again damaged 4 months later on March 10th of this year when Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, again a Boeing 737 MAX, crashed 6 minutes after takeoff. That crash resulted in the deaths of all on board, 149 passengers and 8 crew members. After that crash, I, along with many of my colleagues on this committee, signed a letter asking that the 737 MAX be grounded. That decision was not political. That decision was based on the tragic facts, on the tremendous loss of life. We supported the grounding of the 737 MAX because we felt it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do for the pilots. It was the right thing to do for the crew. It was the right thing to do for the flight attendants, for the passengers, and for the public. I represent an area that surrounds Logan Airport. The main runways out of Logan take the majority of flights over my district, over the homes and schools and neighborhoods of the people who live in my district and who I represent. An air disaster like Lion Air or Ethiopian Air 302 coming out of Logan Airport, crashing minutes after takeoff in a densely populated area would be a mass casualty event on the ground in my district. So it wasn't a political decision to ground the 737 MAX after those accidents. And it won't be a political decision to put those planes back in the air. It'll be based on the assurances that we have because of the experts that we have here today and the diligence that we will apply to the testing of this system that will rule the day on that decision. I do want to ask Captain Sullenberger, the descriptions of the Lion Air disaster report that because of the faulty data on that angle of attack, the angle of attack data, the MCAS system forced the nose of the aircraft downward, quote, more than 24 times during an 11-minute span. And there were reports from other pilots who have had similar problems that the plane acted like a bucking bronco. I'm just wondering, some people are trying to blame the pilots here. And I'm just wondering, with an aircraft behaving like that, is it fair to blame these pilots? Because you would think that if we could get the software right, they wouldn't have to deal with an aircraft that's acting like a bucking bronco. I just don't want to take the easy path and blame the pilots.
I think asking, well, first, we shouldn't be blaming dead pilots. We need to do much more than that. But asking whether this was a pilot error or design error doesn't really address the right question, because human performance is a variable and it's situation dependent, and we must make accurate assumptions about what's possible in extreme emergencies, given the distractions, the workload, the task saturation. You're right. We shouldn't expect pilots to have to compensate for flawed designs. But we have to realize that everything we do, our entire system, the aircraft designs, the way we train pilots, the culture we have, the knowledge we give them, the information we give them or withhold from them, determines three important things. How many errors...
Captain Sullenberger, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get it in writing. Those three issues will have to be in writing to the committee.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I'm moving on to Mr. Payne. We'll have to take it for the record. Thank you. Representative Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to express my condolences to the family and friends who suffered from this tragic event. But Captain Kerry, based on your experiences, what, if any, improvements can be made by the process that the FAA uses to evaluate what pilot training is required on new aircraft?
Well, I'd like the administration to look into future designs. For example, the Boeing 777-900 will be in production in the near future. I'd like to see pilot involvement, just like they do in the shipping industry or the United States Navy, where the crews are involved in the development of the airplane or the ship from when they lay the keel. I think that we have the subject matter experts at American Airlines Management, aviation side, and the aviation side of the Allied Pilots Association to put significant input into the design and development of modern jet aircraft. I believe that if any of our pilots would have seen the MCAS system early on, that it would not have slipped through the cracks and not have entered service without robust training.
Thank you. And that doesn't happen at this point now?
No, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Pinkerton, as you're aware, many airlines have canceled flights because of the grounding of the 737 MAX, causing immediate operational challenges and other issues. What are the long-term effects of a continued grounding on your carriers and the flying public?
Congressman, as I mentioned in my opening statement, carriers have been able to adapt. They are doing things like utilizing spare planes. They are postponing doing optional things like painting planes or putting on Wi-Fi. So they're taking a number of steps to ensure that we have the needed capacity in the system. And in fact, for the busy travel season, we're going to be up as an industry, up an overall 3% increase in capacity. So these are challenges. I don't mean to make it sound easy, but we are managing it to really mitigate the impact on passengers.
Okay. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll be kind and yield back.
You're my favorite member today. So that covers committee members, and now recognize Representative Sully for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I always wanted to be on this subcommittee, so I'll try to be your second favorite. That'll be a challenge. To the family members here, I couldn't help but think, search my memory from high school in the Arthur Miller play about All My Sons, if you remember that, about people who built military aircraft in World War II and cut corners. The ending of the play was by the person who was involved in cutting corners, and I'm not saying that this was the case in this instance, said I should have thought of all of those pilots as my children. And I think there's a good analogy here that we all should think of any loss of life should, although they weren't our children, we should think of it that way. Captain Sullenberger, nice to see you.
Good to see you, Congressman.
For the chair and others, Captain Sullenberger has had the good wisdom to live in my district from time to time, so we've gotten to be friends, and I have great respect. We're working on a bill on safe landings as a consequence of the Air Canada near miss at SFO, and I want to thank the committee staff and the chair for helping with that. We've spent a lot of time, you and I, talking about human factors, and you talked about it in your comments, and Captain Kerry, and maybe you can jump in here, and your comment that we can no longer define safety as the absence of accidents, I think was very well put. So I look at the aviation industry, my perspective is you've got these issues on technology and human factors that we see in the chemical industry, the refining industry, the healthcare industry, and we're learning more and more about neuroscience and how we can help with that. So being able to do that is important, but you also have, in my view, the coming consequences for the aviation industry on climate change, how we're going to deal with that. I had an amendment put in appropriations that Academy of Sciences would look at that and look at all transportation, because we're going to have more disruptions and pilots are going to have, and air traffic controllers, more challenges, and I anecdotally can see that. And then lastly is what's a reasonable rate of return for the shareholders, knowing that you want private investors, but when they can move their investments around, there's pressure sometimes to cut corners. And sometimes to some people that's a euphemism for efficiency. So when it comes to human factors and the blending, particularly of new technology, both of you have been eloquent, but could you add a little bit more to that we could institutionalize it? Because I'm afraid we've become compliant or complacent in this field because of our great safety record.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you for including in your bill much more emphasis on and funding for study of human factors. And as we use more and more technology, that human-machine interface is going to become even more important. I would say that talking about the federated versus integrated system, where Boeing, as a fix for this lately discovered instability issue with the MAX, they have appended to a conventional airplane a computer-controlled system, but without giving it the integrity, the reliability, the redundancy that it should have had. And so that needs to be part and parcel of everything that we do going forward, making sure that when we have any device or feature in an airplane that can autonomously move flight controls, in this case a secondary flight control, or change engine thrust, it needs to be built to those high standards and certified to those high standards.
Captain Kerry, you have anything to add before I yield the balance of my time so I can...
I'll leave you some time left, sir.
Please.
I just have a quick comment about the near miss at San Francisco. And we talk about one level of safety all the time. The Canadian pilots have more much more liberal flight time, duty time regulations than the U.S. pilots have. And I think maybe future panels should look into requiring overseas carriers to operate into our country under our rules and regulations.
I'm going to yield back the balance of my time and thank the chairman for letting me sit on this hearing.
That's fine. Thank you, Representative Sully. So I understand there's no other questions from other members. I do have one set of questions for the full panel. First off, for Captain Sullenberger, those three elements that you were going to cover for Mr. Lynch, what are they?
The design of our systems in which we operate determine how many errors will be made, what kinds of errors will be made, and how consequential those errors will be. And the safer we make our system, the fewer errors there will be, the less serious they will be, and the better the consequences of the inevitable human errors that are made.
Thank you. For all the members of the panel, is there one area of inquiry that you think this subcommittee should pursue? What would, in your view, the next step for the subcommittee be? We'll start here. If you have one now, then we'll take it. If not, we'll take it for the record.
I'll think on that and provide you something for the record.
Thank you very much. Representative Captain Kerry?
Critical checklist. For example, the MCAS, the airworthiness directive after the Lion Air crash that came out on the MCAS system. The manual trim, we learned after Ethiopian that it was almost humanly not possible later stages in the event for a person to move the manual trim wheel. So we not only have to devise checklists, we have to make sure those checklists are able to be performed by a flight crew in that situation.
Yeah, thanks. Captain Sullenberger?
I would love to add two thoughts. First, that each aircraft manufacturer must have a systemic, a comprehensive way of safety risk assessment that can review holistically entire aircraft designs, looking for risks, not singly but in combination. And the second thought I would have is that leadership starts at the top. Quality and safety start at the top, and it starts with governance at the board level of our aviation manufacturing companies. I would love to see more people with men and women with subject matter expertise and who understand the science of safety, and that means engineering expertise. Someone needs to be a pilot on the board who understands the implication of design choices.
Interesting. Thank you. President Nelson.
In terms of getting the MAX back up in the air, there just simply needs to be transparency in the process and a full explanation to all the stakeholders and continued involvement. But what I think that this committee needs to really look at is the relationship between the FAA and the manufacturers and the airlines, and this issue of client and customer relationship as opposed to governance and oversight from the FAA and proper funding to get that done.
Thank you. Mr. Babbitt.
Yes, sir. I think the FAA, with committee oversight and manufacturers as well, need to devote a little more energy to understanding what's coming in the future with this relationship between the man and the machine and the interface. I have quoted in my written testimony, I didn't give it here, but in my written testimony I quoted Chris Hart, former chairman of the NTSB, who said, you know, automation does a wonderful job of masking weaknesses in human performance, but it's amplified when that automation fails. And I think we need to understand better what we can do to protect that from happening.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the panel of witnesses for coming today, for responding to our request to be here, for helping the subcommittee understand better what the flying public thinks we ought to be doing as opposed to what the FAA thinks or the industry thinks. And it was very helpful, and I appreciate it. And before I gavel out, I do as well want to recognize the families, relatives, and friends of the men and women who were the victims of the two crashes. Thank you for coming again, for being vocal in your efforts to ensure that this subcommittee stays accountable to the families and relatives and to the flying public here in the U.S. With that, There are no further questions. Asking unanimous consent, the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And if no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.